Call Me If You Get Lost, an album that I think debatably caused the biggest rift in Tyler's fan base since Cherry Bomb. It seemingly took elements from pretty much all of Tyler's work and almost combined them all together, spreading them out through the course of an album. This was a similar sentiment that was said about Igor upon its release, saying that Tyler had combined his more gritty sounds that came from his first few projects and combined them with the sounds from his last two projects, Cherry Bomb and Flower Boy. Call Me is arguably a whole different beast entirely, however, and stays a lot closer to this idea of combining sounds from different periods in his career. At this point in his music career, Tyler has leaped far beyond any boundaries that may have once inhibited him from producing what he wants, which was a genuine problem for him around the time Cherry Bomb was released. I elaborate more on this situation in my Cherry Bomb analysis. However, to summarise, the fan and critic response to that album was largely negative, especially when compared to all of his previous work. With this negative reaction perhaps being one of the most profound moments to happen in Tyler's career. Cherry Bomb was a largely experimental album for Tyler, and didn't fit in line with most of his other albums. However, I think most people are aware with hindsight that perhaps it was rated a bit harshly when it first released. It's one of the only albums in Tyler's career to have a proper re-evaluation from both fans and critics, where upon listening to Flower Boy and Igor, they now understand what Tyler was attempting to achieve on Cherry Bomb, now praising it as a good album, with some even claiming that it's his best. So why is this important to Call Me? Because arguably, I think we're in the exact same position as we were back then, but perhaps with lower stakes and less backlash. I'm sure at this point, Tyler is so sure of whatever he's making that nothing will really faze him. However, from what I've seen, both around the internet and responses on my own videos, I know for a fact that this album hasn't pleased everybody. Unlike the reaction I saw when Igor was released, which was just huge amounts of non-stop praise, I did genuinely see a lot more people simply saying that they thought the album was just okay, or downright disappointed their expectations. However, I feel we are genuinely back at the Cherry Bomb dilemma, because upon my first reaction of the album, I felt somewhat a similar way. But upon analysing and reanalysing, listening and re-listening constantly during the making of this video, I can confidently say that Tyler has 100% made the album that he wanted to make, and I personally think it's an incredible piece of work. As I said, Tyler's at the point where he only really ever needs to make whatever he wants. Pandering to anyone is completely out of the question. And with that in mind and the music we've got, it's a different direction, but one that ultimately works very well, especially when considering the heavy emphasis on the concept of the album, which we're going to see in this video. Unlike Cherry Bomb, which I saw more as a transformation in Tyler's sound, Call Me is almost a culmination of all of his past work, which not only relates to the musicality of the album, but the lyrical content too. And with all that being said, let's get into the analysis of Tyler the Creator's Call Me If You Get Lost.
The sun beaming.
We start the album off with the slow introduction Sir Baudelaire, which sets us up with a considerably dark tone, especially when hearing the instrumental. The title of the track references the 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire, and before we analyse the track, I'm just going to play a part from my previous video, as I think understanding who Baudelaire was is quite vital to understanding the direction Tyler takes on this album. Charles Baudelaire was a French poet, whose work included characteristics primarily from the Romantic movement, which was at its peak from 1800 to 1850. Romanticism originated from Europe, and was distinguished by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of all the past and nature. Baudelaire's most well-known piece of work is arguably his Les Fleurs du Mal book, which included almost all of his poetry ranging from 1840 to 1867. Most of the poems included stay close to themes relating to decadence and eroticism, within these themes touching on specific areas like sin, obsession with death, and the aspiration towards an ideal world. The track uses a sample from Billy Cobham's song Siesta, with the guitar and clarinet sounding so much more twisted and distorted than the original version. Tyler comes onto the track straight away, first just claiming that the sun's beaming, an idea that will return several times throughout the album, with a brighter atmosphere now being established, juxtaposing with the darker tone of the track. In this intro, we also get introduced to what almost seems to be Tyler's hype man, who crops up essentially on every track throughout the album and and quite frequently as well. This hype man is known as DJ Drama, an American DJ who has a large catalogue of doing ad-libs on rappers' mixtapes, some of those rappers being Tyler's favourites, such as Pharrell and Lil Wayne. Other than just having these ad-libs there to sound the way Tyler wants the album to sound, I also believe that this fits conceptually, with a large part of the album being a reflection on his past, both before and after he gained fame. After the album's release, Tyler made a short video with DJ Drama and posted it to Twitter, mentioning how his 15-year-old self would be ecstatic at this ever happening. Drama serves essentially as the narrator for the album, sounding like a hype man throughout, but actually revealing details if you pay attention to what he's saying. In this intro, we also get the re-emergence of a name we haven't heard throughout at least his last 2 projects, and that is Wolf Haley, a name which simply refers to himself. There are 2 main uses of the name Wolf Haley, one being simply another stage name that Tyler likes to use, with Tyler putting the director on all of his music videos as Wolf Haley, as well as having other names like Young T and Ace the Creator, but it also relates to the more complex and detailed character Wolf Haley, which we saw within the Wolf trilogy on his albums Bastard, Wolf and Goblin. I have a separate video on my channel about that if you'd like to find out more. To say the least though, with Tyler's past couple albums almost seeming like he was trying to distance himself as far as possible from anything in his past, it's like this time round he's actively reflecting and embracing this past. We start Tyler's verse with him essentially talking about the position he's currently in within his day-to-day life. In the first few lines, we can see that Tyler is seemingly going on some sort of vacation, or at least some kind of break from his normal work. He mentions the food that he's bringing with him, the smell of his vest being jet-fueled because of the expensive and fast cars that he's been known to drive, and finally his swimming trunks for the Geneva water. The mentioning of Geneva, that place being a city in Switzerland, tells us that we aren't in our usual environment, and that perhaps, much like Tyler feels as a foreigner in Switzerland, we're about to feel like a foreigner when presented with the direction of this album. He then mentions a passport, of course referencing the cover of the album, before saying that he needs a pick for his afro. This setup is very important to understanding the tone and concept of the album, as upon analysing only these first lyrics, we've already established that Tyler is outside of his usual environment, and has an emphasis on travelling away from where he's usually known to be. He then mentions being a bunny hopper, making us assume he's talking about a bike, before then mentioning that he was actually talking about his new fancy car with doors that lift open. The last time the term bunny hop was used in any of Tyler's work was in fact on the song Slater from his album Wolf, a song which talked about the love he had towards bikes, and a specific bike which he named Slater. By them mentioning that the lake water has dried off by the time he was at the French Open, the lake being a prominent location throughout the Wolf trilogy, he's saying that he's moved on from who he once used to be. As opposed to constantly riding around on bikes with his friends and messing around, just like how he's progressed throughout his career, he's progressing in life and simply evolving as a human being. He continues to say that he's proud of the position he's managed to get to, so doesn't feel guilty when he rubs it in other people's faces, before then going back to his past, claiming how he used to be reckless. This would of course once again be relating to when Tyler first entered the rap scene, being continually hounded by media outlets for some of his outrageous lyrics that touched on topics like rape and murder, whilst also using incredibly vulgar and offensive language throughout. This even led to Tyler getting banned in countries like New Zealand and the UK for a short period of time, claiming that he was apparently a threat to their cultures. This reckless attitude could also be seen outside of his music, in shows like Loiter Squad, which showed Tyler and his friends creating oftentimes offensive sketches and outlandish pranks, all delivered under the attitude of not caring what anyone says against them. Just like how Tyler has reflected on his past work, he's reflecting on his past attitudes and opinions, slowly transforming into a more mature person after apparently seeing What Them Commas Do. That lyric perhaps referring to the actual punctuation mark of a comma, showing that as Tyler's grown up, he's not only become more punctual and regimented with how he lives his life, but he's also learned a lot more about life in general. The idea of using commas instead of not using them being a metaphor for Tyler's growth in knowledge. This is further reinforced as we reach the last part of this verse, where he starts talking about his clothing brand, saying the style he's choosing to follow will make summertime look like private school. Of course, the private school aspect of that relating to the growth in knowledge I just mentioned, however also quite literally represents Tyler's outlook on the style of clothes he's choosing to make with his latest clothing season. Tyler even said himself that the clothing he produces has a certain preppy aesthetic to it. He ends the verse off saying that he's a true connoisseur due to his tendency to touch on different areas like TV, music, and fashion, and manage to create things that are not only profitable, but actually liked and enjoyed by many. Despite this, however, he still likes to keep a low profile whenever possible, as he's mentioned several times in the past that he doesn't like it when artists are constantly interacting with fans and have no good music to show for it. Tyler instead chooses to keep his appearances brief and impactful, making his mark and then going back into hiding again. The final lyrics show Tyler considering what most people know him for, especially because now he has his hands in so many different areas of business. But he eventually pins it down to everyone knowing him as the spaced out guy with the chunky ears, once again perhaps linking back to Wolf, with that description being the most reminiscent of the Wolf album cover. The final line shows Tyler claiming there's a mansion on a USB, showing Tyler's awareness of his presence within the music industry, knowing full well that no matter what he releases, it's still going to make a lot of money. In the outro, DJ Drama gets reintroduced, saying that he hopes we've been spending our time wisely between the period of Igor's release and Call Me's release, before saying that this music is for the sun seekers, perhaps alluding to people who quite literally will sit outside on a sunny day and listen to this music, but also perhaps being a metaphor for people who chase the sun, meaning to follow your dreams. Tyler is also interspersed in between these lines, talking about how he's got bikes on the tarmac and perfume on his skin, showing this collision of what almost seems to be the two halves of Tyler's career at this point. The idea of the bike representing his first 3 albums, Bastard, Goblin and Wolf, which all had a darker tone, and the idea of perfume representing his next 3 albums, Cherry Bomb, Flower Boy and Igor, all of which had a lighter and more emotional tone. The song ends off by essentially setting us up fully for the tone of this album, that being one where Tyler is travelling the world, whether that be literally or metaphorically, or in the past, present or future. It's all going to be about Tyler reflecting on the experiences he's had during his life, as well as the ones he's currently experiencing in the present. We then get brought to the next track, Corso, the title of this song referring to the Italian word for a social promenade, basically meaning to take a walk or perhaps a drive with the sole intention of being met or seen by others out in public. This immediately lets us know that this song is going to focus more on the social aspects of Tyler's life as opposed to ones he thinks about inside his mind. The track starts off with Drama once again hyping up Tyler, claiming that he goes by the name The Creator, but to us he's Tyler Baudelaire, perhaps referencing once again the outlandish direction Tyler's already taking on this album, saying that despite him usually being known as Tyler the Creator, it's essential towards the concept of this album that we don't see him as that, but instead this Baudelaire character instead. It's worth noting that once again the tone of this track appears to be considerably darker and more twisted than a lot of what we saw in his last few projects, taking us back to a sound more akin to Tyler's past. Tyler enters the track going straight into a fast, hard verse. Once again, something we haven't seen for a while, with his last few projects taking a heavier emphasis on singing and the instrumentals. Tyler references these cookie crumbs in the rolls, which we also saw him mention on the previous track, but then elaborates on this by saying that they're never no weed crumbs, referencing Tyler's notorious straight edge mindset and dislike towards drugs. He arguably goes into as much detail as possible about this on his album Cherry Bomb, constantly bringing up how he feels drugs are simply used by people to run from themselves, and only ever get in the way of true progression and enlightenment in a person's life. This verse, however, goes straight down a different path after this, as Tyler starts mentioning how someone he knows hasn't talked to his girl in 3 days, and that it doesn't have to be that way. This is the first moment where Tyler establishes this relationship between him and the girl, which is only reinforced and expanded on as we journey through the album. From the outset, we already know that this girl that Tyler's interested in is already in a relationship, presumably with someone who Tyler thinks isn't good for her and keeps neglecting her. Tyler even says that he'd be down for a 3-way relationship if the offer was on the table, just because the infatuation towards this girl is so strong. Tyler then briefly touches on the idea of buying a boat, but decides against the idea when considering if Capri has space, before then saying that he doesn't really need one anyway. anyway. This not only brings up Tyler's huge amount of wealth that he's attained throughout his career, with a boat usually being seen as a luxury item to own, whereas he sees it as something that he could just buy off the cuff and never use, but it also brings up another location, this time being Capri, which is located in Italy, staying close to the themes of travelling around the world. Tyler then spends the rest of this first verse saying that finding someone else like him is going to be a hard task for anyone, perhaps internally feeling like this girl should break up with her man and go off with him, and also has the attitude of thinking whatever he currently has will never be enough. With him saying that despite having this huge amount of wealth, he's got his eyes set on having a net worth of $1 billion. Feeding into this, he also mentions that he's not going to call up Sony, referring to Sony Records, the label which Tyler is releasing music under. This also just shows that Tyler is completely set in his own ways, and only wants to adhere to his own creative vision, with the idea of hitting up Sony and discussing business being wholly unappealing. We then get a short break from drama, where he simply says that they've apparently been playing with the listeners up to this point, before taking us straight into another hard verse delivered by Tyler. He starts by taking full focus on this girl that he's interested in, perhaps revealing that there's a history that they share. Tyler claims that when spending time together, they did a French waltz, a type of traditional dance that is usually done by partners in a romantic relationship. The girl says that she likes Tyler's car, that being a Rolls Royce, and it seems like Tyler tries to impress her by asking which one, flaunting the amount of expensive cars that he owns. He then continues to flaunt his wealth, talking about the amount of property that he owns, telling her to catch him in his other crib. He then proceeds to simply break down his own character, first saying that he wears ascot, referring to the posh and expensive clothing that is traditionally worn at the Royal Ascot horse racing event in England. He also says that his passport's got tattoos, perhaps once again referring to the cover of the album, with his license of travel being custom, with him even putting a smiley face on the signature. He finally says that he's slim with a big dick and a gap tooth, before then claiming that people always call him Mr. Always on some shit you've never seen. A name which both shows Tyler's perception of himself, doing things that nobody either has the balls or ambition to pull off, but also a name which is reminiscent of one of his previous names on the album Wolf, with there being a definite link between this name and the name Mr. Treat Your Nose, which we saw on the song 48. He ends the verse off by becoming a bit introspective, a juxtaposition from the intense and empowering bars he's delivered so far, claiming that despite having all this wealth and fame, he's still sat in his huge mansion living single and alone. Tyler's aware that onlookers will simply claim that he's entitled, not understanding that the money he's gained gives him easier access to material things, but isn't necessarily a gateway to happiness and fulfillment. Despite this reality, Tyler simply says that he doesn't care about the people's thoughts, and that within his music, he can choose to talk about whatever he pleases and doesn't have to adhere to anyone. This brings us into yet another break from drama, introducing himself as well as Tyler and the several names he goes by. The name Bunny Hop being one we haven't seen up to this point in his career, before then leading into the third and final verse. In this verse, Tyler almost becomes confessional, saying that he tried to take someone's girl because he's a bad person, but doesn't regret it because something was worth it. We don't actually hear what this something is because it gets replaced by a chant, however we can only assume that Tyler's talking about sex, and how it was so good that he doesn't regret a thing. All of these events seem to be just thrown at us at a sudden and rapid pace, especially considering that most of the song up to this point was Tyler simply setting eyes on this girl for the first time. This would be because what Tyler does here is foreshadow the events that are gonna take place and be expanded on later in the album. He goes into even further detail, saying that despite this relationship they had, it was short-lived, with the girl eventually deciding to stay with her boyfriend instead of breaking up with him and running off with Tyler. He also says that he hopes when this girl and her boyfriend are fucking, that she's thinking of him, revealing a layer of genuine heartbreak and anguish that the girl didn't decide to get into a relationship with him instead. Tyler then reveals that this might in fact be based on a true story with how intricate he gets, saying that when this verse drops, he's sure that he'll get a deep text from this girl. However, he doesn't really care at this point, because not only has his heart been broken, but also his ego and confidence has been affected too, something that we know is very important to who Tyler is as a person. He then elaborates on this heartbreak, saying that when all of these things took place, he was left heartbroken and crying his eyes out on a jet, with the only outlet he had to make himself feel better being to spend more money to distract himself. This once again feeds into how money can't buy you happiness, with that only being a temporary relief to underlying problems, quite similar to how people use drugs to distract themselves from confronting their problems. He ends the verse off saying that he might just buy that boat which he mentioned earlier on the track, because he'd prefer to cry into the ocean. What we've just witnessed is the events of the album. This is basically the groundwork for what we're about to experience in all of the upcoming songs. It's quite similar to what movies like Fight Club and countless other films have done, where they start off showing you the ending of the film and then proceed to take you back to the start and show you all of the events that led up to that point. This already starts this album off with a pretty heartbreaking tone, knowing full well that no matter how much joy Tyler experiences within this album, it's inevitable that it's all gonna come crashing down by the end. This ends the song off, leading straight into the next song, which we can presume will jump back in time to whenever these events took place. This is where we'll be able to start to piece together the inclusion of things like the references to his previous work, and Wolf in particular. This song once again opens up with drama hyping up the track, making reference to the COVID-19 pandemic, but not taking it any further than that. Simply saying if they were to be removed from the rap game, that will be like a global pandemic because everything will go crazy. I believe with this track, we're at the true starting point of the story, with several subtle references making us aware of what time period we found ourselves in. Listening to the instrumental, we have these clearly MIDI brass instruments blasting from the start, very similar to Tyler's track Domo 23 on the album Wolf, already taking us back to a sound that is associated with Tyler's past. He starts the first verse talking about his house, mentioning how it leans and has a mean view, most likely referring to Ladera Heights, a place in California which he's lived in for a while, even being born there. He says that if you look out his windows, you might even see a few yachts, linking the environment he lives in to a wealthy lifestyle. He also mentions a roommate that won't move out, most likely referring to one of his closest and longest friends, Jasper, saying that if you wanted some beef with Tyler, you'd essentially have to go through Jasper first, comparing him to a cool aunt. Bringing up Jasper is quite an important detail when looking at the next lyrics, as he mentions the Wolfgang, comparing themselves to the Wu-Tang Clan and saying that they're better than them. This single lyric clues us into the time period that most of this album will take place in, with the Wolfgang, or rather Odd Future, being Tyler's old rap collective which sort of just fizzled out around 2015 to 2016. The fact that Tyler is putting an emphasis on this and talking about it with excitement tells us that these events probably took place around the time Odd Future were at their peak, but before they broke up. So I'm willing to say that we're probably looking at anywhere between 2013 and 2015. It's an important detail to recognise that despite these events taking place in this time period, I think we're still getting told all this stuff from Tyler's perspective in the present. For example, in the upcoming lyrics, Tyler talks about how he's cuckoo, meaning crazy, an attitude that seems much more relevant to how he used to act, compared to how he acts nowadays. But then in the next lyrics, he mentions how he used to stage dive, but if he did now, he'd probably get sued. I suppose it's still plausible that around the time of Wolf and Cherry Bomb, Tyler was thinking like this, but to me it just sounds too retrospective to not be told from Tyler's current mindset. Tyler then goes on to mention the things he spends his money on, and what they're actually worth to him. He can't deny that he does somewhat feed into what's considered normal for a famous person to own, such as expensive cars and clothes. However, as Tyler mentions, despite having all these expensive luxury cars, he feels like he has too many, with most of them simply sitting around, not being used, and collecting dust. He also mentions how he turned down the offer of having a Patek, referring to one of the most expensive luxury watch brands in the world, and decided to spend his money on artwork instead, because he finds more worth in that than a fancy watch which he doesn't even need. This, more than anything, shows the importance of artistry and creativity within Tyler's life, an aspect that will be important to remember in some of the upcoming songs. Tyler stays on with this idea of turning down a Patek watch by showing us with his nonchalant attitude in relation to the price that even if he wanted to buy one, he'd easily be able to do so because of the amount of money he's earned. Again, it's just not something that's important to Tyler, so why would he waste his time going out and buying one? He ends his verse off showing how outlandish and different he really is compared to everyone else on his level, saying that he's the first person to put a bike rack on a Rolls Royce. This of course shows the distinction between how Tyler lives his life and how others around him do, but also shows the importance of integrity and being aware of your roots, with the idea of bikes being something that has been carried across Tyler's entire career, showing that no matter how far he matures and moves on, ignoring the past is not an issue for him. We then get brought straight into the second verse, rapped by 42 Doug, who almost appears to be a polar opposite of what Tyler stands for. He starts off with some quite surface level lyrics talking about how he's young, rich and famous, and fucks hoes. It's where we see him mention 80 for a gram and the Patek watch once again, where we can really notice the juxtaposition between him and Tyler. Whether this is done intentionally, I'm unsure of, but I find it strange that we just came off Tyler's verse where he focused on specifically the Patek brand of watch and claiming how meaningless it is to him, only to have the next verse immediately start with someone flexing their Patek watch. This juxtaposition stays pretty much consistent throughout the entire verse, with 42 Doug elaborating further on both his drug use and how he sells and produces dope. Perhaps this contrast is made to simply reinforce Tyler's point, which he brought up throughout his verse, where he mentions how he's different to what a typical rapper is usually identified as. When Doug is finished with his verse, it seems like the song is about to end. However, before we get to the next track, we have an outro with a completely different tone, sounding calm and relaxing. This is one of the many interludes within this album, all sharing this similar kind of atmosphere and usually including spoken word. The phrase "call on me if you get lost" is repeated several times from Tyler in the background, but the main focus is the dialogue we hear spoken from Frank Ocean. He describes his brother running their finger around an Ai Weiwei bowl, which is sat on his counter almost like a fruit bowl. Ai Weiwei is a Chinese contemporary artist whose artwork sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This focus on money and expensive things in general is a theme that has been running through this album from the very start, but not in a typical flexy way that a lot of rappers fall into. Almost every time money has been brought up, it's been neither a positive or negative thing. There's sort of just a nonchalance attitude in relation to it. Of course, here we see an expensive piece of art being treated like a normal fruit bowl, which costs much less money. But on top of that, Frank simply mentions it and moves on to what his favourite colour is, showing literally no care towards the expensive object. Perhaps this is showing Tyler's overall disillusionment of fame and the money that comes along with it. It's a typical goal in life to want lots of money, because that's simply how the economy works. But what Tyler is saying here is that when you attain this money and jump any economic barriers by a huge margin, there's something in the hard-working nature and grind within people that's lost. We then get brought to What's Your Name, a track with a distinctly different tone than any of the previous tracks, sounding glossy and bright. This would be because this song signifies the moment that Tyler first sets eyes on the girl, the title of the track reinforcing this, alluding to Tyler not yet knowing her name. The intro of the track shows Tyler nervously talking about things like his pickup line, quite blatantly showing his immediate infatuation with this girl, perhaps having a love at first sight kind of situation. Tyler starts the first verse by talking about the appearance of the girl and what he wants to do with her. First saying that she looks malnourished, immediately starting to paint a picture on what this girl looks like, with Tyler saying she's slim. Tyler says that to help her out, they should make French toast and drown it in syrup, before then listing off several other things that he wants to do specifically with her, like flying abroad and going to Cannes Film Festival. He continues to list these things off for a large part of this verse, however then mentions to her that if she's got a boyfriend, that she should break up with him and completely cut him off. This makes us aware that despite Tyler ultimately being in the wrong, as we know he'll eventually discover that she's got a boyfriend, upon meeting her, he initially wasn't aware of this. The emphasis on passports and taking flight with this girl remind me of the song Okaga CA from Cherry Bomb, another song where Tyler has a love interest that he wants to pack their bags and run off with him to some other location than they're currently in. Whether that connection is more literal, perhaps with the girl in both tracks being the same one, I'm unsure of. However, the idea of moving away together is one that is definitely shared between the two tracks. Another thing that's shared between many of Tyler's tracks talking about a love interest is his unrelenting infatuation with them. Not just seeing them as someone to talk to or have sex with, but someone he wants to sit down and just be with. He wants to just chill out with this girl and encourages her to speak about any lingering feelings with him, most likely in relation to the situation with her boyfriend. Tyler ends the verse off using clever wordplay, saying that this girl was a bright light and he's a moth, showing how closely he's drawn to her, and then says before they start, he first has to know her name. This could perhaps mean that either Tyler was simply imagining saying all of these things to her in his head while simply looking at her from afar, but could also mean that he's so unbelievably drawn to her, he's jumping so far ahead on the things he wants to do with her that he doesn't even know basic details like her name. This leads to the chorus where Tyler repeats the phrase, "What's your name, girlfriend? What's your name?" The word girlfriend being used by Tyler to perhaps quickly put a label on them so they can have a deeper connection quicker. This brings us into the second verse, rapped by Young Boy Never Broke Again, essentially being a mouthpiece for Tyler's emotions, starting the verse by once again asking for this girl's name. He ensures her that no matter what is necessary in her life, he'll be able to provide it and will try his hardest to please her, letting her know there's no boundaries to the things he's willing to do. Young Boy also mentions a McLaren, a type of car that has been closely associated with Tyler for a while, with him bringing it up time and time again throughout his music. He also says that he appreciates her body compared to any fashion accessory that she may be wearing, and states that he hopes she's not proud at the things he's bought. Perhaps trying to go deeper into figuring out who she is as a person, with lots of people having the attitude of gold diggers, not liking the person for who they are, but simply the things they own and the amount of money that they have. Young Boy implores this message in the next lines, saying that the value he gets out of spending time with this girl, even if that's just a minute, far outweighs any genuine capital that he may earn on a day-to-day basis. His verse ends off by once again taking a step back and realizing that this girl does have a boyfriend, and that's a genuine concern. Telling this girl that for his sake, she's gonna have to take things slow, because he's uncontrollably moving fast and trying to get into a relationship. This leads us back into the chorus once more, before then taking us to a short outro, where Tyler tells the girl at the end to stop playing around and just let him pay off her mama's debt, once again offering to do anything to impress this girl.
Pull up, black boy.
This takes us to Lumberjack, another song with a harsh sounding beat and a non-stop barrage of bars delivered from Tyler. He starts the song at a rapid pace, immediately spitting bars about him rolling up in his Rolls Royce to some event. The emphasis on saying that he's a black boy hopping out of a Rolls Royce most likely stems from the idea that black people are usually downtrodden in society and in turn are poorer than the common person. Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly is essentially all about this idea, which I've also explained on the channel if you want to check that out. He then gives a shout out to his mother and surprisingly his father before being cut off. The track gets quieter and pares down the instrumental as Tyler simply starts talking about his mother's reaction to what we can presume to be the Grammys in 2019. This was when Tyler won Best Rap Album, getting his first ever Grammy, and it looks like here he's simply recounting the events of that night, taking a focus on his mother's reaction in particular, with her saying that she'd never seen anything to the scale of this event and was crying when Tyler won the Grammy, with Tyler saying that it was a beautiful moment. Before going into the chorus, Tyler also uses a clever metaphor to describe his evolution as an artist, saying that you should always keep picnic blankets in the back of your car because you never know where you'll end up. Of course referring to Tyler's past, being outrageous, getting banned from countries, and being considered generally antisocial. Nobody thought Tyler would be nominated for any awards, let alone arguably the most well-known and established music award, the Grammys, let alone actually winning one. It speaks primarily to doubters and naysayers, who seem to only ever shut down possibilities from a narrow and usually bitter mindset. This takes us to the chorus, where Tyler repeats the same lines from the intro, with the line about his father becoming clearer that shouting him out isn't really a positive thing, but not a negative either. Tyler has talked about his dad pretty much throughout his entire career, and primarily focuses on the absence of him, with his dad leaving Tyler and his mother from a young age, with Tyler having no recollection of him as a person. Because of this, there's several songs in Tyler's discography which focus solely on his father, most of the time talking about him in a wholly negative light. Here though, Tyler shows his indifference towards him after thinking it over pretty much his entire life, saying at the very least he thanks his father for not pulling out and allowing him to be born, because if he did, we wouldn't be getting any of this good music. Tyler continues to talk about defying expectations in relation to race, saying that despite being a black man, it almost seems like he's on top of the world, selling out huge venues like Madison Square Garden and earning huge amounts of money from it. Tyler also uses wordplay here, using the word whips to describe the numerous amount of cars he owns, but also mentioning the whips that were used on his slave ancestors, who would have their shirts taken off and whipped on their bare backs. It shows the evolution of what's possible for a black man to achieve in society, which he then applies to people who live in a poor hood environment, who haven't gained the same amount of fame and wealth that Tyler has. People who live in these areas don't deserve to be living the way they are, and it's not the fact that they're not working hard enough, it's simply because of the hand they've been dealt in life. This could perhaps be linking to some form of lingering guilt within Tyler, mentioning the amount of money that should be given to people in the hood, before then saying that he's the lumberjack, with a look on his face that's described as wanting to help out, but ultimately does nothing. Firstly, the meaning of the lumberjack is of course relating to someone who cuts down trees. However, in Tyler's case, it quite blatantly relates to him cutting down trees and turning them into paper, meaning money. Despite all of this money Tyler's earning, he's still incapable of helping out a poor and downtrodden community, with him desperately wanting to, but ultimately ends up just saying at the end of this verse that they aren't getting the paper that they deserve, doing his best to spread this message on a larger scale and hoping something will change. This brings us to the first verse, starting off with Tyler once again not comparing himself to others, distancing himself from everyone by claiming that no one else is on the same wavelength as him, and don't do the same things as him. He then mentions calling up Drizzy, referencing well-known artist Drake, and saying that he has $1 million for him, most likely referencing his infamous appearance at Tyler's Camp Flognaw festival. During the event, it was revealed that there would be a surprise guest performing, with most people assuming that it would be the notoriously reclusive Frank Ocean. However, it turned out to be Drake, who came onto the stage and promptly got booed off by the audience. After this happened, Tyler was pretty embarrassed at how these people reacted, and as we can see here, was probably also pretty annoyed that he shelled out a huge amount of cash only to have people not enjoy the performance. Tyler then proceeds to talk about how he owns all of his companies in full, so doesn't need to take any loans out to help him pay for stuff, before then mentioning the Grammys once again, being sure that there were people who were pissed off that he managed to win one. This would again be down to Tyler's controversial past, with others not willing to forgive and forget certain past actions, always seeing him as a menace. Tyler describes that he keeps the Grammy on a shelf not surrounded by anything so it can breathe, and be seen as a sign of major achievement. He also says that because he doesn't know how to celebrate anymore, perhaps linking back to his maturity, but maybe just his confusion at being immensely famous, the only way he knew how to was to buy another expensive car. We can see Tyler's disillusionment here, most likely thinking that something like a get-together with friends and family isn't a sufficient amount of celebration for his Grammy win, deciding to celebrate the only way he knows how, by shelling out more cash on things he doesn't really need. He ends the verse off saying that it never rains where he lives, but he came with an umbrella anyway, referring to Tyler's uptight and defensive mindset in relation to what he owns and what he's achieved, but also referencing the well-known umbrella that comes with every Rolls-Royce model, with it being stored in a slot in the car door. We then get brought back to the chorus again, which simply repeats what we heard the first time round. However, before we get into the second verse, we hear Tyler's friend Jasper shout, "It's different, it's really different." Quite a vital thing to mention in relation to this album, with the overall tone and style being notably different from all of Tyler's previous work. Coming into the second verse, Tyler says that he might just go sled in Utah because LA is too warm, bringing up travel once again, and wanting to get out of his usual environment. Tyler then starts talking about someone who is tall, describing him as Mulan, the well-known Disney character. Despite being released in 1998, the character has found perhaps even more relevance today, with Mulan being held as a queer icon in the LGBTQ community, with the idea of bisexuals being brought up in the form of the character Li Shang. This may be telling us that, like that character, Tyler is further elaborating on his sexuality, perhaps perhaps alluding that he's a bisexual, as opposed to being gay, which many people speculated after Igor and Flower Boy. Tyler then jumps away from this idea and takes the focus back on himself, describing his salad-coloured emerald fingers, which reference the nail varnish that he's got on, which can actually be seen in the Lumberjack music video. Tyler then proceeds to go on this braggadocious rant, starting off by saying that no one is on the level of his music and live performances, mentioning his explosive song New Magic Wand and how mad things get when he performs it. He then mentions how his music and lyricism is nuanced, with this previously making him seem like an outsider and a weirdo, which he's mentioned before, once again on his album Wolf on the track Rusty, where he describes how he liked to hang out with the drama club kids and hated the popular kids in his school. He describes people laughing at him and listening with their ears closed, a clever way of saying that people were simply faking their interest in whatever he was saying or creating. Tyler ends the verse off essentially rubbing his success in these people's faces, making them think that if they were just nicer or actually listened to him for once and didn't just shut him down or not pay him any attention, they might have been able to have some of Tyler's huge amount of wealth. This ends the track off, with the outro simply repeating the chorus briefly before having Jasper pretty much make fun of Tyler's lyrics before transitioning into the next song. This song opens up with Drama essentially setting the scene, saying that at this point they've just landed in Geneva, a place which we last saw mentioned in the opening track Sir BAUDELAIRE, also describing that they're on a yacht, with Drama being fed French vanilla ice cream, emphasising this laid back and lavish lifestyle they're partaking in. Tyler comes onto the track in the first verse, seemingly picking up from where WUSYANAME left off and taking focus on Tyler and the girl's relationship. He starts by expanding on the plans which were set up in WUSYANAME, where Tyler constantly talked about wanting to run off with this girl and going to some place they've never been before. It seems that on this track, he's actually going through with it, saying that he's going to travel the globe with this girl, speeding through the events at a fast pace, much like how he was taking things fast already, telling the girl that she needs to slow things down for his sake. Tyler describes getting driven to the airport, finding their passports, and then getting on a flight to somewhere. We can presume this will be Geneva. However, Tyler makes a point of saying that he needed to ask the pilot where they were even going, making a point of how he wants to get intentionally lost with this girl and make a deep connection. Tyler describes the amount of luggage they're bringing being quite sizable, with his wallet looking like a folding chair from the amount of cash that's inside, showing that he has more than enough to pay for any extra costs if necessary. Tyler also mentions the Cartier that he's wearing feeling so light on his body, referring to the high-class Cartier jewelry conglomerate, once again showing off his wealth. He then references wanting to be known as Tyler BAUDELAIRE once again, whilst also mentioning Tunichi, which is a nickname for artist Lil Wayne, who also features on this track. Tyler once again mentions being out in Switzerland before getting more intricate with the things him and the girl are getting up to, mentioning how he's so hyped that he's travelling with her and that he loves it when she kisses him and when she lets him rub her like Michelin, referencing the Michelin Man mascot, making a connection between the words rub her and rubber that's used in tyres. This shows us that not only is their relationship deepening and going exactly how Tyler wants, but also that the girl is reciprocating and being unfaithful to her man. This is an important detail to note, because as much as Tyler knows he's doing wrong, the girl is arguably just as bad for reciprocating any of Tyler's advances. We can assume Tyler booked a private jet for the two of them, as he mentioned spending $100,000 to be able to sleep on a bird, obviously referencing the flight that both a bird and a plane is capable of, as well as saying how quiet and calm it is. He pretty much continues this throughout the rest of his verse, talking about the luxuries he's indulging in, such as some delicious fresh fish, but also acknowledging the fact that he's basically just flexing on everyone, saying that he keeps stunting on people, making them sick to their stomach, but he can't help it because he just wants to express the life that he's currently living. The verse ends off with Tyler saying that despite him and the girl getting lost on their travels, the relationship they've now established has made them sure of who they are, so getting lost with each other is more of a positive and exciting prospect as opposed to a negative. We then get a short break, with Drama saying it's these kinds of activities which Tyler partakes in, which are the ones you won't be seeing on his Instagram, simply because they're too lavish. This brings us straight into Lil Wayne's verse, which for the most part simply reinforces the message of the track, but adds nothing new to the overall storyline of the album. He has some clever wordplay alluding to the wind that's mentioned in the title of the track, saying that it blows so hard against him, comparing it to a tough situation that you will inevitably experience in life. The way he describes this, claiming that he's in the middle of a sandwich like slaughter meat, may also show that he's serving somewhat as a mouthpiece for Tyler at points, with that situation sounding quite similar to Tyler inserting himself in between a couple's relationship and potentially fucking it up just for his own selfish gain. There's other parts of this verse which are obviously relating to Wayne himself though, mentioning his concerns revolved around his drug use, saying that the copious amounts of lean that he consumes have started to make him feel like he's going senile. However, in classic Wayne fashion, a large bulk of this verse simply focuses around his prestige as a rapper, constantly claiming that he's just on another level compared to anyone else in the rap scene. There's an interesting part towards the end of this verse, however, where he mentions the Wolfgang once again, simply adding even further to this idea of this album being linked to his past work, with perhaps his album Wolf being the most prominent focus. The song slowly finishes after Wayne's final explosive bars. However, before we get taken to the next track, Drama for the first time on the album doesn't refer to Tyler as Baudelaire, but instead Wolf Haley, a name which we haven't seen Tyler use in his music for years now. This makes us think that the next track, Massa, will perhaps be the most introspective track on the album so far, looking back to Tyler's past in a more literal and blatant way.
Massa couldn't catch me, my legs long than a bitch.
Firstly, the title of this track refers to the idea of slavery, with the phrase being akin to the word master. This already clues us into what this track may be touching on, with Tyler several times throughout his career feeling like he was starting to be put into a box and generalized, his creativity being slowly taken away from him. He opens this track preaching in the intro to essentially follow your dreams and do whatever it is that brings as much joy into your life as possible. He uses his own experiences to reinforce why he feels like he's qualified to say these things, looking back on when he first blew up on the rap scene, with him not even being 20 yet, being able to leave Los Angeles for the first time due to his newfound fame. Before this, and before Odd Future became a globally recognized collective, Tyler describes his life as a bubble, feeling trapped and constrained by so many aspects. So to finally have that bubble pop, and have so many opportunities open up, all in his best interest, is arguably one of the most impactful moments in his life. Of course, staying on with this idea of travel, now becoming clear that it represents a form of freedom to Tyler personally, the emphasis on leaving LA is made clear, with Tyler saying that his passport is one of the most valuable things in his life. This takes us out of the intro right into the short chorus, starting by mentioning how his master couldn't catch him because he's got too much self-respect and long legs. This sets us up once again for the content that's going to be included in the track, with Tyler saying from the outset that one of the main reasons he's gotten this far in his career is because he's never chosen to dumb down his sound or go in a direction he doesn't feel like going in, despite how much people within the music industry might have tried to convince him otherwise. We then head straight into the first verse, with Tyler fast forwarding a few years from when he initially blew up, saying that it was around the time he was 23 when he finally started maturing, reinforcing that with metaphors of growing up, such as growing facial hair and growing out of old clothes. In terms of his discography, this would be during the period between Wolf and Cherry Bomb, with Tyler turning 23 in 2014. This fits perfectly in terms of the differences we see between Cherry Bomb and his previous albums, with it being such a leap from what pretty much everyone expected from Tyler. He elaborates on this by saying that the reason Cherry Bomb may have sounded so shifty, strange, and in some cases just not good to some people is because changes were actually occurring in his own personal life, and his outlook on the world as well as his tastes and attitudes were constantly changing. He describes this by using a metaphor of a caterpillar going to a cocoon, obviously with the next stage being the transformation into a butterfly. Tyler directly references here the backlash that was received when Cherry Bomb first came out, giving us more clarity on the situation by saying that despite it perhaps not being to everyone's taste, that period of time was arguably one of the most important in his whole musical career, as it gave him the chance to become hugely experimental with his sound, discovering how to become even better than he already was. Tyler then starts speaking directly to his millions of fans, describing them as a singular entity. An important point he touches on throughout this track is his age, with many people forgetting that when Tyler first blew up, he was essentially still a teenager, and hadn't fully developed into the man he was going to be for the rest of his life. This comes with the positive of being rich and famous from an extremely young age, but also the negative which Tyler has suffered immensely, where people's first impression of him is apparently the definitive version of him. With Tyler being 19 when he first blew up, it was almost inevitable that he was going to change, but his fans didn't want to let him evolve and progress as a human being. They didn't want him to make albums like Cherry Bomb or Flower Boy, but instead keep repackaging things that he's already made before. However, with Tyler being such a creative powerhouse, he wasn't going to let this stand and simply had to go on the creative journey that led to him making the albums that he did. Tyler then proceeds to go even further back in his life, saying that from a kid he was always curious and asking questions, whilst also never caring about anyone else's opinion on how he lives his life and the things he chooses to pursue. He then mentions Skateboard P, meaning Pharrell Williams, giving him a speech during an Italy session, which we may have seen Tyler mention during an interview with Larry King, where he describes that one of the best pieces of advice he's ever gotten in his life was from Pharrell just telling him to be who he is.
What's the best piece of advice you ever received?
I think Pharrell I think it was him. He's just like, dude, just fucking go. Just be.
Good advice.
Just be.
Tyler then describes the years that led on from that in a rapid pace, fitting with how rapid the changes were in his life around that time, quickly turning into a butterfly and having his album Flower Boy be made as a result of this change. Unlike Cherry Bomb, Tyler was completely sure of himself, as well as his creative vision, so upon its release it was met with immense amounts of praise from both fans and critics, pretty much the flip side of what happened with Cherry Bomb. As a result of Flower Boy's success, so many things opened up for Tyler, with him saying that during the period after its release, it was the first time he flew a private airline, the first time he got incomprehensible amounts of accolade from people that were both familiar and unfamiliar with his work, and also one of the first times his songs got played on radio stations. Because he was so vulgar and offensive before this, he was pretty much shut down and ignored by so many onlookers, because they thought he was simply a one-trick pony who was just crazy for the sake of being crazy. Another evolution that spawned out of this period was the change within Tyler personally, both emotionally and physically, with him mentioning how not only his outlook on style changed, meaning things like his fashion sense, but also the style of music he was choosing to make. On top of this, his body and feelings seemed to evolve as well, which we can see in his past few albums manifested itself with Tyler becoming increasingly more personal, emotional, and sentimental. Tyler also mentions how he decided to calm down when cameras were rolling, because being loud and obnoxious is not only something he doesn't want to do anymore, but it also would reflect badly on him once again, and seem like a regression from the progress that he made with Cherry Bomb and Flower Boy. Tyler then becomes quite blatant with his lyrics, basically shutting down any fan expectations of him returning to the person that he once was, saying that he's not that boy that everybody first knew when he was 19, referencing the Yonkers music video, which was one of the main proponents to Tyler's meteoric rise to stardom. He also mentions how during this time his mother was living in a shelter, referring to his mother's living situation, which we can presume was not ideal, marking the moment that he managed to move her out of there as the moment that he'd finally made a name for himself and was an established artist. Leading on from this, Tyler states that he never came from a rich background, despite what others may say, claiming that it's purely because of how he lives his life now, which as we know from this album alone is lavish and luxurious. He never was troubled by financial problems in his past. For people who grow up in a poor environment, much like how Kendrick Lamar mentions on TPAB, it's also expected that you should inevitably fall into the same traps like drug use and crime like everyone else in the same situation. Tyler, however, played it smart and decided to simply be who he was and not turn to such vices, because with the amount of self-confidence he had from a young age, he knew he didn't have to do those kinds of things. Tyler then uses some incredible wordplay in relation to the people who are still suffering financial problems, and are stuck in the same situation he was stuck in years ago, by saying that although he's attained huge amounts of wealth, now getting taxed huge sums of money because of this, none of this money that gets taken is actually put to good use. Tyler makes a clever observation by saying that despite him thinking taxes are in concept a good idea, hopefully making life a fairer and better place for every individual, no impactful change can ever be witnessed, making it seem like they're just punishing Tyler by plucking his petals away, meaning his money, but ultimately never putting it to any good use for those who really need it. He ends the verse off bringing up the song Pothole from his album Flower Boy, mentioning how in schools and whilst growing up there will always be doubters and naysayers, haters, especially if you're doing something creative. Most commonly because these people who mock and jeer are simply jealous and envious of the creativity that can come out of certain people. This too frequently stops people from doing what they want to do, being too scared of the judgment and other people's opinion of them. Whereas Tyler has always had the attitude of not giving a fuck, so was never prevented by anyone else's opinion. The chorus is then repeated once more, adding a couple more lines this time round, talking about how he keeps his eyes open and his mind alert, because he really has no one else to rely on but himself. Whereas some people turn to things like religion as a form of solace, Tyler's a well-known atheist, so only does things for himself. As we build up to the second verse, drama comes onto the track, bluntly stating what Tyler was saying throughout his first verse, recognizing that everyone only has one life, so to cave to any social pressures or not try hard to get what you want is simply doing yourself a disservice. As drama says, it's up to you and you alone to decide how far you want to go in life and how much you want to experience. This takes us to the second verse, taking us back to the present and focusing on how Tyler's currently feeling, immediately going back into the mindset of focusing on materialism and money, with the opening lines referencing how he buys more cars when he feels like he's third wheeling. Once again showing the disillusionment Tyler feels towards fame and money, with spending money being one of the only ways he knows how to cope with his emotions now, which we also saw him mention on Lumberjack, saying that buying cars was the only way he knew how to celebrate. Tyler then weaves these materialistic things, specifically the features included in his Rolls Royce, with the search for love that he's been on. Starting off with the sunroof, claiming how it's his favourite part of the car, which gives him a panoramic view of the sky, before then slowly transitioning back to his feelings towards the girl, saying that he's always been on the search for a perfect true love, but up until this point, everything he's found has simply ended in disappointment. We can really see in this part Tyler's attempt to distract himself from his loneliness once again with expensive things, but having that quickly pushed to the wayside when his true emotions come into the frame. We can also see in this part that Tyler likes to live his life solely in the present, with him getting frustrated that she's already fell in love with someone else, but commitment is not an end goal for him personally, showing that all he wants to do in this moment is be with this girl, with the ideas of a breakup or fallout between them not even occurring to Tyler. He then begins to touch back on the temptations that come with getting famous, with him specifically mentioning some of his friends who got too comfy with being in the public eye, which led to them falling into several traps like incessant drug use, causing them to lose direction and focus, eventually having their money start to dwindle as they spend it more and more on drugs, without earning anything in return due to their twisted mindset. As we continue through this part, frustration is a key word that comes to mind when listening to how Tyler delivers his lyrics, with him now going on to mention sarcastically that no one should pay attention to the things he's going through because he's a celebrity and should always be happy and never complain, much like how he mentioned earlier, really pushing in the point that just because he's rich and famous, it doesn't mean that he's not human and suffering the same kinds of problems everyone else goes through at some point in their lives. This frustration also carries over to his love life, stating that everybody he ever loved had to be hidden away in the shadows, most likely because of the huge reaction which spawned from Tyler revealing on Flower Boy that he's most likely not a heterosexual man. However, as we've seen through this album, as well as this upcoming lyric, Tyler's sexuality has been confusing to nail down, with him even saying that it felt like a constant tug of war in his mind between X and Y, referring to the X and Y chromosomes, with females having only X chromosomes and males having X and Y chromosomes. This most likely alludes to the idea that Tyler would be considered bisexual, which is completely normal. However, from his perspective, by the way the media reacted to him becoming more emotional and opening up about his sexuality on Flower Boy, it felt akin to a custody battle, giving Tyler much more stress than he wanted. This would be because around the time all of this first came out, there were several media outlets claiming that Tyler was either trolling or simply trying to cover up his past actions where he'd frequently use homophobic phrases. This stress had a profound effect on Tyler, comparing his emotions to feeling like a boat was going down and sinking, with him not having any paddle to save himself. As we can almost predict, this leads him to turning to his money, trying to distract himself by considering buying a house in Seattle, and in fact trying to flex on us and distract us from his true feelings by also saying that he's living sweet, which is usually associated with being happy. As we crawl towards the end of this verse, Tyler becomes increasingly more intense with how he delivers his lyrics, mentioning how he thinks people around him want him to do well, simply from the basis that they'll get something out of it. This was an idea also featured on the song Pothole, which has been brought up once already in this track, with Tyler even saying that he's so paranoid about people using him for monetary gain, he compares them to thieves in the night, taking stuff that he's earned and running away. Tyler then uses wordplay centered around food, starting off by saying that someone's throwing heat his way because they're beefing for fun, with whoever or whatever this is being unclear. No matter what heat's getting thrown his way, Tyler says that he's vegan, of course contrasting with the idea of beef, showing that he's not interested in getting into any shouting match with anyone. He simply just wants to make music on his own terms, without any inconveniences in between. However, as we careen towards the end of this verse, it becomes more clear that Tyler is talking about music critics, both ones that write for established organizations, as well as everyone who posts their thoughts online, with the idea of everybody being a critic becoming very present in our social media heavy age. Tyler mentions his gratefulness for the position he's in, but still thinks some of the comments that get thrown his way, both criticizing his work and his character, are simply hateful, eating away at his self-confidence and picking apart every single detail in order to make him feel self-conscious. Tyler claims that the people who have time and time again railed on his work simply don't have the capability to relate to the kinds of things he talks about, whether that be lyrics where he talks about money and fame, or the ones that talk about more personal, emotional issues. It's undeniable that Tyler puts his heart and soul into everything he makes, with his main focus being music, describing his lyrical content and storytelling as an artist painting an illustrious picture from his soul perspective. The biggest frustration, however, comes in the last lyric, with him being devastated that with all the time and effort he puts in, people are willing to shut down and say it's bad without even a second glance. The emphasis of the lunch break line is extremely important in showing how Tyler reviews any kind of critic, thinking that they'd either follow the most popular opinion or get their thoughts out as quick as possible without any kind of reevaluation later on. This quite clearly references the reaction Cherry Bomb got once more, with people initially not recognizing the direction Tyler was going for and simply shrugging it off as a bad album without even listening any deeper. This ends the track off, with Drama coming in for the outro telling people to check their resources, feeding into this same idea of people criticizing things without even being aware of the intentionality and artistry of it, and not even caring when they get called out on it. This brings us to the next song, Run It Up, starting off much calmer than where we just came from in Massa. The track starts with an intro, where we can almost barely hear Tyler ranting underneath a wall of distortion. However, listening closely, we can see that he's still talking about some of the ideas brought up in Massa, frustrated at the fact he was alienated and made to be an outsider because of his nuanced and intricate approach to most things. Tyler shows the self-confidence that has been present throughout his entire life by deciding to not bow down to what other people would consider normal, but stick to doing what he wants to do. With him being proud of this fact, and almost flexing on these doubters of the past by saying how much money he has. It's now becoming clearer with the emphasis Tyler has on the past, that in this album, the heavy emphasis on money may be in relation to this fact, as well as trying to distract himself from his lonely life. He references the popular kids in high school once more, saying that's when they peaked in life, with everything after that point simply being a slow and arduous decline. Whereas for Tyler, during this period, he not only stayed true to himself, but also worked as hard as he possibly could to get what he wanted, leading to him living a lavish and easy life. He then proudly lists off the traits that don't link with him, saying that he's never felt things like anxiety or nervousness, and never second-guessed himself in relation to what he wants in life. As Tyler says himself, he always goes full throttle on everything he does, claiming that he doesn't even know what fear is. Drama then comes onto the track, loudly claiming that apparently the listeners didn't think we were really going to be here. A strange lyric to hear out of context. However, when listening to the instrumental of this track, I don't think it's a coincidence that exactly at the point he says this, we hear the digital brass instrument again, being very similar to the sounds that were included in his album Wolf. Before we go into the bridge, Drama simply hypes up Tyler once more, more, saying that for most people, the sky's the limit, but because they've already reached the sky, they're trying to go even further and reach the beyond, high up above the clouds. This brings us to the bridge, where Tyler in an almost slow-mo fashion delivers lyrics about giving expensive checks in exchange for luxury clothing, like ones made by well-known fashion designer Raf Simons, but also states that he's running out of things, solely down to the fact that he's got so much money now, relating to how he's bought so much stuff already that not only is it starting to become a meaningless effort, but also the possibilities of what's possible to buy, whether the item's meaningful or not, are dwindling. Tyler then repeats the phrase, "Bitch, I'm running," leading us into the chorus where he states that he might just spend all his money in a day for no apparent reason. Once again, we can see Tyler's disillusionment towards the amount of money he has, getting annoyed at the thoughts he's having in relation to it, so instead opting to perhaps get rid of it all to get these kinds of thoughts out of his head. He repeats this sentiment several times before leading into the first verse, which starts by showing off Tyler's nuance, which he's mentioned, subtly delivering lyrics about his rise to fame, describing Odd Future's arrival onto the rap scene as getting off the boat, with him comparing their projects to a tee-off, which is the first hit in a game of golf. This all links to Odd Future's rapid rise to fame, but most prominently the influence that came from them, coming into the rap scene with these outlandish and unusual styles and attitudes. As Tyler mentions, this was because they saw off the scope, once again not adhering to anyone's pre-established expectations of what a rap collective should and shouldn't do, but simply doing their own thing, even if it didn't result in them getting the amount of attention that it did. Tyler then refers back to his own role within Odd Future, always being the most well-known member of the group, and how he almost ran in and created a huge ripple through the rap community with his first studio album, Goblin. Tyler becomes specific with the influence he thinks projects like Goblin had on listeners, saying that before, lots of people had blue skin, which is a metaphor used to describe hiding behind a mask and putting up a front. However, once he released Goblin, referencing the green background of the original cover, these people who used to put up a front all of a sudden became confused at how a group of people could be so genuine and unfiltered, so didn't know how to act. Tyler then begins to list off the things people go out of their way to do in order to show their appreciation of him, saying that fiends moonwalk, deaf people speak, and the dead start running in his presence. He then delivers some lyrics about once again having a lot of money, and mentioning how Goblin expanded the possibilities of what was possible to be said on a rap album, before saying that he's on fire and that you can't fuck with him, with him claiming that the reason for that is of course because of his rap. Tyler shows his appreciation towards rap music as a whole, saying that at times the lyrics in rap music all helped us at some point to have some clarity on certain situations when we may have been in the dark otherwise. This is true not only for Tyler's music, with him being deeply personal and delivering lyrics that I'm sure many people can relate to, but also artists like Kanye West, Kendrick Lamar, and Lil Wayne, whose artistry have inspired and empowered so many listeners who may have otherwise had no outlet. We end the verse off with Tyler first having a single line where he addresses someone directly, saying that in reality, rappers mean nothing to them, but they do genuinely mean something to their listeners, perhaps taking aim at politicians, the people who are actually in control of countries and have incomprehensible amounts of power over people's lives, as opposed to artists who only have their message and their following. Tyler then turns his attention back to the listeners, saying that if anyone is staring at their ceiling at night, perhaps contemplating certain aspects of their life that they're not satisfied with, Tyler wants to let you know that it's always possible to reach for the stars and follow your dreams. Even if it all results in failure, it's undeniable that trying to achieve the things that are most important to you is necessary in at least having a chance at getting what you aspire to have. This brings us to the outro, which once again repeats the chorus, whilst also having small interjections from artist Tizo Touchdown, who uses several similes in relation to how they're running, comparing it to a politician running for a place in government, fitting in line with the political themes from the previous verse, and also saying they're running like water on dirty dishes and roaches in the kitchen. The song ends off with the repetition of the line "We gon' run it up," leading us into the next song.
I came a long way from my past nigga, it's obvious.
We start this track off with Tyler mocking the idea of someone telling him what he needs to talk about in his songs, starting off by saying that he bets there's going to be entitled white women saying he needs to talk about black power. Tyler hates the idea of being told what to do, so tells them to suck his dick. Not because he doesn't support black power, but not only does he never want to be told what to do, but as we'll see in the first verse, Tyler also doesn't think he's fully qualified to even speak on the matter. He starts this first verse off by taking aim at religion, and also looking back to the roots of slavery and how both of these areas interconnect. Tyler starts by touching on the indoctrination of religion in young kids' minds. One of the primary reasons for people having religious beliefs being because they were brought up in an environment where it was taught as unquestionable fact. When we're born, the idea of religion isn't anywhere in our minds up until we hear it and remember it from an outside force, like a parent or guardian. Tyler talks about this generational cycle of religion, saying that the ideas that you believe are true stem from your mother, and the same ideas she enforced on you were also enforced on her by her mother. However, Tyler then switches up the final line by saying that your granny simply obeyed her master, having these religious values instilled upon her without any choice in the matter. This idea links back to the slave trade, which was most prominent from the 16th century to the 19th century, bringing up the fact that slaves would usually be forced to convert to whatever religion their masters would believe in, with Americans oftentimes preaching Christianity. This is why the roots of Christian values are often claimed as racist, with it being forced upon others because of their skin colour, with another example being how Jesus is portrayed in a visual sense, usually being considered to be a pale white man, despite being born in Jerusalem from native parents, making us think that perhaps Jesus would have much darker skin and darker hair. Tyler links this with how he doesn't feel he's qualified to talk about any of this kind of stuff, which is constantly debated day in and day out by people that he knows are much more intelligent than him, simply telling people to not take things at face value because there might be holes in their religious stories and blessing, which will get willfully swept over and ignored in exchange for keeping faith and staying true to God. Ultimately, the point Tyler's making is that he's not dumb. He can see a lot of things for what they really are, and has done his research, but he doesn't want to talk about it. One, because he'd much rather focus on his own personal business, and two, because once again, he doesn't want to pander or adhere to anyone else's expectations on what he should perform. This brings us to the second verse, seeing the reappearance of Domo Genesis, one of the members from Odd Future, whose last appearance on one of Tyler's projects was also Wolf. His opening bars talk about how deep their lyrics can go, saying that even if you take a small portion and analyze it, you'll find layers of meaning. Just like Tyler did, Domo also becomes introspective on his feature, saying that because when he was growing up, he was constantly having things thrown his direction that tried to twist his view on the world, he had to reevaluate his life and what was most important to him. Domo then goes on to say that he turns into a fiend if the idea of peace is brought to him, making a strange juxtaposition to the somewhat haunting beat and his hard vocal delivery, basically saying that if peace and calm was on the table, he'd take it over anything. He then touches on the idea of black cruelty and civil rights within America, asking how he's supposed to be protected in his country when all of the laws that are set in place lead to black people getting more unfairly treated and put in prison. This focus on black cruelty and police brutality would of course be in relation to events which took place between this album and Igor, such as the situation that happened with George Floyd and the hundreds of protests which came as a result. Domo states bluntly that these racist people want his race dead just because of their skin colour, not understanding their prejudice, and also mentions how people shouldn't be surprised that he doesn't act right because the stuff he was taught in schools were covering up a lot of America's past. America's school system has been called out several times for this, trying their best to hide monstrous past actions by rewriting history and telling kids their own version to pass on to the next generation. Domo has obviously done his own research and discovered this fact, leading him to lashing out and fighting back against these false and classist systems. He ends the verse off pretty much laughing at these higher powers, knowing that his lyrics do have a genuine impact on listeners, and hoping that they'll bring about change. This takes us to Tyler's verse, starting off by immediately stating that it should be clear to see that he's come a long way from his past, and mentions how people keep bringing up old lyrics that he wrote. trying to get him cancelled but failing. Tyler actively distances himself from his past here, but doesn't discount what he was saying in his lyrics, looking at them more as a time capsule of how he was feeling at that current time. Tyler basically states in the next lyrics that it's pretty much impossible to cancel him at this point, with his initial albums already getting immense amounts of backlash and outrage, with Tyler still managing to come out on top. He also makes the important point of saying that this was all before cancel culture became a common thing, especially on apps like Twitter. He reminisces on people who'd protest outside his shows, responding to them by throwing up a middle finger and not giving a fuck about their opinion. In the next lines, he touches on some tweets he made in 2010 directed at pop singer Selena Gomez, with the tweets being both outrageous and sexually charged, all focused around how he'd like to have sex with her. It's an important distinction that Tyler makes here, because he reveals that he's pretty embarrassed about how he acted at the time, and that he's since apologized to Selena Gomez. Notice how this is completely different from how he reacted to people trying to cancel him because of his lyrics, showing us that when it comes to his art form, that primarily being music, he doesn't think he ever has to apologize for anything because there shouldn't be any boundaries in artistic expression. These tweets, however, were simply out-of-line comments coming from him directly, with him acknowledging his teen-like attitude and immaturity. He also uses these tweets as a chance to delve into his confused sexual mindset at the time, stating that although he was directing these things at Selena, he was most likely overcompensating and covering up his true feelings, saying that he actually wanted to have sex with her then boyfriend, Justin Bieber. Leading on from these lines, Tyler shows his confidence, saying that he's proud to admit these things and does so with his chest out, without any regret or doubt in his mind. He then takes his attention to the racial issues in America, which he mentioned at the start, talking about black bodies hanging from trees and not being able to make sense of the prejudice towards the black community. Tyler then goes into a tangent about what is or isn't enough for him to say on this issue, saying that he went to protests, retweeted messages in support of Black Power, and even donated money to help the cause, but still gets called out for not doing enough. This was something we genuinely saw when the Black Lives Matter protests were in full swing, with people like Kendrick Lamar getting called out for apparently doing nothing, despite literally having a full album promoting Black Power and talking about the very issues that they're protesting against. Tyler's simply trying to say that as a celebrity, there's only so much he can do, and it annoys him that even when he tries to help out, people still aren't satisfied, looking at the amount he does to help and the amount of money he donates, and claiming that he could always help out more than he is. This idea starts intertwining with the things he's been saying throughout his entire career, saying that no matter what he says or does, because of the media's oftentimes negative reaction to things, he's always been made to feel like he's messing things up and saying the wrong thing. So eventually, he just set on the message of telling black kids to do what they want and be their own person. A message promoting freedom, which knowing Tyler's luck would also somehow be twisted in a way to make him look bad. Taking his attention back to the Black Power protests, Tyler references how some of them turned into riots, such as ones in Minneapolis, telling people to calm the fuck down and control themselves before they have to start ducking out of the way of bullets fired in response to their reaction. Tyler agrees with the protests, but still thinks they need to be done in a peaceful manner, not only because the removal of violence will be a much better outcome no matter what, but also because it reflects better on their community. Despite this, Tyler still understands the frustration, saying that it's almost like whenever the black community get a foothold and manage to elevate themselves above the level that they've been forced into, they get shot down and trodden on until they're back down to a level that these racist higher powers are comfortable with. This takes us towards this final section of the verse, where Tyler shows his awareness of what people are doing to fight back against this and shows his full support, despite perhaps still being called an outsider to the cause because of his fame. He touches on this in the final lyrics, claiming that despite him not having dreadlocks, which is a common hairstyle worn by African Americans, and him having gold teeth, contrasting with the poor living conditions and lower salary that many black people live off, he still understands all of their struggles. Tyler has gone through all of the same problems as every other black person has, both in relation to the racism that is often suffered, but also the poverty as well, with us being aware of Tyler's poor upbringing from MASSA. This takes us to the outro, once again with drama telling everyone to catch up and get on their level, with Tyler also telling everyone who spends their day on Twitter being outraged and trying to cancel people to go get a hobby and not waste their time doing something that ultimately won't affect their lives in any meaningful way. Transitioning into this track, we first hear Tyler talking to who we can presume is the girl on the phone, where he explains the plan of going on vacation with her, saying that a driver's gonna pick her up and drop her off where Tyler is. This makes us aware that anything Tyler was saying about traveling around with this girl was simply in his head, with it sounding like things aren't going to plan, with him sounding annoyed, telling the girl to just make something up so she can come hang out with him. We can presume that the girl is conflicted due to the love and loyalty she still has for her boyfriend, so starts sending mixed messages in Tyler's direction. Getting properly into the track, we can see that unlike most of the songs on this album so far, this track will have a bigger emphasis on the instrumental, and deciding to have short verses with singing instead of rapping. Looking at the first verse, we can see that Tyler basically lays out the situation between him and this girl, saying that they met each other and fell swiftly in love, being able to read each other and be on the same wavelength from the get-go. Tyler goes on to describe how beautiful he thinks this girl is, with the only flaw being her name, which leads right to the chorus where he describes that she should be called Sugar because of how sweet she is. This is probably the most surface level we've seen Tyler get in terms of the lyrics on this album. However, as I said, this is definitely intentional, with the style of the track not serving well for anything else than these smoothly sung vocals. This takes us to the second verse, starting with Tyler mentioning that even if he was left stranded and abandoned by this girl, most likely with her returning to her boyfriend, his feelings towards her wouldn't change in the slightest, with Tyler still feeling an immense passionate connection between him and her. He expands on this, saying that quite literally the amount of love he feels for her is infinite, using the idea of the toughness of a diamond not being able to cut how strong this connection Tyler feels. This leads to a bridge sung by Brent Faiyaz, once again further elaborating on the extent of Tyler's love towards this girl, describing the sensation of his heart skipping a beat because of how nervous he is around her, wanting to impress her as much as possible. He compares her to the sun, appreciating her smile by saying that it could light up the planet with how bright it is. This then takes us back to the chorus, and then to a short instrumental break before leading back to the chorus once more, until we reach the outro. As I said before, the instrumental really makes this track. It's arguably one of my favourites on the album. The outro simply reinforces everything that has been said in the track already, listing off the different parts that are so good about this girl before eventually coming to a close. This brings us to a segue, which bridges the two tracks on this song together. The two-part nature of the 10th track specifically being a tradition that Tyler has kept up since Bastard. In this interlude, Tyler further elaborates and clarifies what his plans were, saying that he wanted to stick his toe in and check the temperature, using the metaphor of the level of heat in a pool or the ocean, and linking that to testing if he could spark a connection with this girl and perhaps take her from this other guy that she's already with. However, Tyler then describes that instead of any positive result, he found himself drowning, perhaps alluding to the second half of this track being the reality of the situation, having the girl perhaps draw back from his advances and go back to her boyfriend, leaving Tyler stranded and on his own. Drama introduces us to this second part, I Thought You Wanted to Dance, saying that this kind of music is once again for the sun seekers, which he's mentioned previously on the album. Despite the instrumental not sounding particularly dark or gloomy, it's clear that things haven't panned out in Tyler's favour, with us seeing in the chorus him questioning this girl over several aspects. He first asks the question, "What makes you think I'm not in love?" presumably in response to the girl shutting him down, and claiming that Tyler's not really in love with her, and will find someone else in the future who he has a better connection with. He then asks how she could possibly know what's best for them and their relationship, now calling this girl out on making these swift decisions and alluding to the fact that she's led him on. It's important to note Tyler's vocal delivery on this track as well, with him sounding noticeably more quiet and reclusive, leading into the idea that he's basically just had his heart broken. In the final few lines, Tyler asks her why he's standing alone by himself, considering that he thought she wanted to dance with him, simply reinforcing the idea of Tyler feeling led on and now abandoned by the girl. Despite this prospect, Tyler stays true to what he said on Sweet, and doesn't get pissed off or turn on the girl, with him in the interlude saying that she was so good to him whenever they hung out with each other, and that the connection they had felt so good that he's astounded that she'd go back to her boyfriend. This takes us back to the chorus for a second time, where this time round we hear the introduction of singer Fana Hughes, who is brought on the track to deliver lyrics from the girl's perspective. We see this when entering the first verse, with her responding to Tyler's incessant questioning by first saying that she can't deny that when she's with Tyler, she always feels loved and is having a good time. She then becomes almost apologetic and regretful over her actions, saying she didn't mean to lead Tyler on. It's just that she and her boyfriend are still working and trying new things out together. Letting him down easily, she also says that her energy is still with Tyler, wanting him so bad but not at the rapid pace that Tyler was working on, because she's still got other people in her life that she cares about. She ends the verse off saying that how this situation panned out is not at the fault of Tyler, but she just can't bring herself to get into a relationship with him because of how wrong both of their actions have been over this period of time that they've known each other. This takes us back to the chorus once more, with the instrumental slowly evolving as Tyler repeats the line, "I thought you wanted to dance," building up to a second verse delivered with fast rapping. Coming into this verse, we can start to hear the bitterness come out of Tyler, responding to the girl by saying that he wishes they never met and never connected the way they did. He compares the situation to Lego, with their connection being built upon a good and solid foundation. However, with the inclusion of the girl's boyfriend, there were also always mixed signals between her and Tyler. He continues to use wordplay to describe how in sync and seemingly perfect he thought they were for each other, before then thinking about how different he'd be acting if she wasn't with anyone, saying that he'd tear up her ass and make her eyes roll to the back of her head, showing Tyler's sexually charged inner thoughts. We also see Tyler acknowledge his ego for one of the first times on the album, looking at it in a negative light when trying to convince the girl to go off with him instead by saying that whatever her boyfriend has, Tyler's sure he's got in boatloads. It's in this moment where he comes to the conclusion that of course money can't get him everything he wants, first saying that because of his money he can go and get whatever he wants, but then contradicts himself by then yearning for the girl to pick him instead of her boyfriend, saying bluntly in the next line that he can't buy her choice. Tyler then goes through all of the sacrifices he made in relation to himself to try and impress this girl, saying that she had him smoking joints and cancelling video shoots and flights. The flights and shoots being a financial loss for him, but the joints being a more impactful moral loss for Tyler, with his distaste towards drug use being present throughout most of his career as well as this album. Tyler then launches into an even faster flow, summarising their relationship by using metaphors. First claiming that he was hitchhiking, showing how he was lost and alone before the girl came into his life. Then seemingly out of nowhere, the girl came into Tyler's life, which he describes as pulling up in a car with the driver's seat being empty, signifying how the boyfriend was out of the frame when they first met. Tyler then reminisces on the time they spent together, and how he slowly fell deeply in love with this girl whilst they hung out. We of course know it doesn't turn out in Tyler's favour, however, as he then mentions that love is blind and that he now has to cope with losing and not getting what he wants because she chose her boyfriend over him. At this point, Tyler becomes even more confessional and honest with the effect this has had on him, saying that he hasn't been sleeping well because of the depressive and anxious thoughts that have overwhelmed his mind. He describes how he's been keeping himself busy, presumably with his music and several businesses, because whenever he has the chance to relax, he also has the chance to think and reminisce on what he once had with this girl, which only furthers his depressive thoughts. He ends the verse off on the most depressing note of the album, claiming how he looks at old pictures of the girl and him having a good time, before quietly ending the verse by saying once again that he thought she wanted to dance. For the first time on this album, we've seen Tyler's happy and explosive journey come to a screeching halt, with both him and us listeners being unsure of where the rest of this album is going to lead. The outro of this track shows the heartbreaking prospect of both Tyler and the girl saying that they wish the timing was just better and that they were both single, also saying that despite her being in a relationship and Tyler being rejected, they'll still save a dance for one another if the time eventually comes. This takes us to the interlude Mumma Talk, which, as you can probably assume by the title, is literally a conversation between Tyler and his mother, with a smooth instrumental playing in the back. From the opening, we can hear Tyler's mother presumably talking about Tyler's long-gone father, saying that his dad was handsome, but takes credit for how Tyler looks, saying that he got his looks from her. We can see the close bond between Tyler and his mother in this part, with her saying that she'd be willing to kill someone or sacrifice herself for his sake. We also get a look back at his mother's past, showing that she was rather aggressive and confrontational, even saying that Tyler used to film her beating up other women who crossed her, as well as getting angry towards what we assume to be senior roles, like teachers and principals. She says this all under the attitude of not giving a fuck, asking Tyler if she has any reason to lie, with him confirming that everything she's saying is true. The connection between her and her kids is so strong that she'd even be willing to beat up other kids if it meant that hers would be safe and happy. She describes a particular boy who we can presume was up to some kind of mischief around Tyler and his family, which led to her scaring him off and telling him to go get his mum, presumably so she can get into an argument and maybe even fight with her. She explains how all the people around the neighborhood would say that she's crazy, happily willing to be seen as this because of how much she cares about her kids. As we reach the end of the interlude, his mother finally describes how Tyler's sister would try to calm her down and stop any altercation that she was involved in, with Tyler simply watching from the background and cheering her on. The way she delivers these lines completely reflect Tyler's upbringing, with even her tone and style of pronouncing certain words being almost exactly the same as Tyler. It really shows how much of an impact Tyler's mother has had in his life, not only protecting him at all times and believing that he can do great things, but also being a major part of how Tyler's attitude has been shaped.
Dedicated.
This transitions us into the next song, Rise, which opens up with Drama saying that this one is dedicated to Tyler's haters and non-believers, something that Tyler's focused heavily on throughout a lot of this album already. Drama cuts himself off, however, saying that he doesn't want these people to leave because he wants to witness them stare in awe at Tyler's rise to the top, stating that it feels better that way. On the pre-chorus, Tyler simply reinforces this message, telling these haters and doubters to not leave yet so that he can flex on them as much as possible for ever doubting his ability. The chorus also repeats this same sentiment, saying that when he rises to the top, he'll show these people something, with that presumably being his response to how they treated him in the past. This takes us to the first verse, with Tyler mentioning how once he became famous, these previous doubters and haters came out of the woodwork and tried to get something from him, whether that be a moment in the spotlight or some money. He tells these people that they should be embarrassed, spreading the message that people shouldn't be so judgmental and shut down other people's ambition because 1, it's just negative for the sake of being negative, and 2, may be thrown back in their face in the event that they actually make something of themselves. Tyler then makes reference to what people have deciphered as rapper A$AP Nast, talking about not being the only person in Paris. Tyler revealed this on a live stream on Instagram, saying that to anybody who thought their style was stolen by him, that they'll never amount to anything, at least nowhere near the level that Tyler's on. This all stemmed from A$AP Nast claiming that Tyler had stolen his style in a series of posts on Instagram, which are simply just based on Tyler dressing somewhat similar to him in a few photos. He continues to basically destroy not only Nast, but all of his haters by saying that whatever they have going on in their lives is so dead compared to him, comparing them to a deputy of a sheriff, showing how they aren't in charge and are below Tyler's level of fame and success. Tyler believes these people's mindsets are jaded and warped under the influence of bitterness and jealousy, using the well-known idea of carrots being able to make you see better in the dark, and comparing it to how blind these people really are in relation to both him and themselves. He further elaborates on this, quite harshly saying that everyone involved in these people's lives are fucking pathetic, before then saying that with as many comparisons as you want to make between yourself and him, it's undeniable that whatever Tyler is supposedly copying, he's doing it much better and getting more success. He ends the verse off describing how whenever these same people are in his presence, and not just saying stuff from afar over social media, they look terrified, presumably realizing that they're out of their depth. It seems like Tyler really doesn't understand where these people are coming from, drawing comparisons to their skin colours, sarcastically asking if it's just because they're both black that they think Tyler is copying them, ending the verse by saying no matter what it is, he'll always be ahead of them, not wanting them to ever forget that. This leads us back to the chorus and then to a bridge, delivered mostly by the artist Daisy World, with the lyrics following along the same lines that have already been established within the album, referencing Tyler reaching beyond the stars, with her also mentioning his resilience, claiming that even if he falls flat on his face and fails at what he wants to achieve, he'll simply wake up tomorrow and try again, learning from his mistakes. This takes us straight to the second verse, with Tyler opening up aggressively once again, letting what he calls these punk motherfuckers into his thought process, seeing himself as the person who had boatloads of confidence and took a chance to make a name for himself, most likely also referencing Chicago-born artist Chance the Rapper, who also took the opportunity to make a name for himself, coming to prominence around the same time that Tyler did. He then states that because of the amount of time he spent working on music throughout the years, he can basically do it with his eyes closed, of course referring to the turn of phrase which shows how easy a task can be accomplished. Within this, he also references Michael Jackson's well-known condition, vitiligo, which according to Michael himself, turned pretty much his entire skin white, despite there being rumours of him bleaching his skin constantly being in circulation. Tyler mentions this to once again reference the difference between him and his naysayers, saying that it's a black and white issue to who's more successful and creating more impactful work. Tyler then launches into another barrage of lyrics, all relating to how people wanted to cancel him when he was starting his rap career, telling him what he apparently can and can't talk about, with him responding to them in a back and forth fashion where whatever they request from him he actively goes against. He also mentions the idea of a cat having 9 lives, with him pushing it up to 10, maybe referring to the amount of times he's tried to be boycotted and stopped, with him always surviving and coming out on top. He ends the verse by telling everyone that's giving him hate and trying to water down his artistry to something more suitable for them to fuck off. The chorus is then repeated one more time before we get led to the outro, with Tyler simply repeating the same lines from the start of the track about wanting his haters to stay and witness his rise to fame, with drama being heard in the background, hyping up Tyler's position.
Niggas is blessed.
We then get led to another interlude, with this one feeding into the same theme that was on the previous track, with Tyler talking about how blessed he currently feels with how everything in his life has transpired. This interlude, like Mumma Talk, features only spoken word over an instrumental, almost like Tyler's reinforcing and giving clarity to certain themes that he thinks are important on the album. As you can probably assume, the entirety of this song is literally just Tyler talking about all of his successes, with him first mentioning the success of his Golf Wang clothing brand, which he says is doing so well he might open up another store, most likely referencing the old Odd Future store which was located on Fairfax Avenue in LA. He also mentions his Golf Le Fleur shoe being bought at an immense rate, and his festival Camp Flognor becoming one of the biggest and best festivals in the world. Tyler then goes on about himself and how he's happy in his own appearance and general well-being, but it's the next line that might be the most important, especially in once again deciphering what part of Tyler's life this actually reflects. He mentions scoring music for commercials, with the possibility of creating music for a movie soon. However, we all know that Tyler worked on music for the Grinch movie which came out in 2018, making me want to propose that this takes place around the time of Flower Boy, which not only was the period which marked the release of the Golf Le Fleur shoe, but also fits with how Tyler says he's writing shows, with his show The Jellies also being released around this same period. Now, it is possible that Tyler is referring to present events, with most people probably associating the commercial to the Tell Me How It Tastes song he made for Coca-Cola. However, it's moments where he mentions falling in love, which also makes me think that this is taking us back to a past event, with us knowing that on both Igor and this album, Tyler's relationships never ended up working out. This does make me think, however, that whoever he fell in love with eventually will turn out to be the person who Tyler talks about in Igor, all making sense in the timeline of events. This brings me to an important point in relation to the album's title. Due to Tyler's intricate and detailed lyricism throughout the entire album, which has also been relenting by dropping verse after verse in quick-fire rapid fashion, it makes me think that the idea of getting lost, both in terms of the lyricism, concept and instrumentals, are all intentional. If you think about it, the idea of reflecting on his past and mentioning things that have happened to him crop up all over the album, with it only becoming clear when and where these things happen under further analysis. It's undeniable that everything fits and works well, flowing impeccably. However, I'd argue that a lot of people will almost inevitably experience some form of confusion at some point in the album's runtime. Whether that be in relation to what Tyler's talking about, perhaps not lining up and staying consistent on a certain time period or theme, but also in terms of the instrumentals, which we've seen can go from extremely calm to extremely blown out over the course of one track. The title has several meanings, with another one possibly relating to his love interest on the album, but we'll touch on that later on. For the rest of this spoken word passage, Tyler simply talks about things like wanting his hair to grow longer at a faster pace, and encourages his listeners to come get lost with him, not taking anything that he owns for granted, but also not denying that he's extremely wealthy and living a luxurious, privileged life. This takes us to the song Juggernaut, which starts off sounding rather uplifting and bright, with the intro including drama once again hyping up Tyler. When Tyler is introduced on the track, he talks about cutting some fresh lemons and wondering where the sugar is, linking to the well-known phrase about life giving you lemons and making lemonade. This phrase is primarily used to describe turning a bad situation into a good one, with the idea of sugar also being reminiscent of the song Sweet, where Tyler said that the girl's one flaw is that she didn't have the name Sugar because he thinks she's so sweet. The lemon, in this case, represents their relationship not working out and the turmoil that spawned out of that situation, with Tyler not being able to find the sugar in order to turn these sour lemons into lemonade. He also mentions having lemons in his ears, which is a reference to the track LEMONHEAD from earlier, with him talking about the earrings he has in, which are shown off in the Juggernaut music video. As we reach the end of this intro, however, the track seemingly takes a complete tonal shift, with the introduction of a hard, dark and bassy beat, with Tyler launching straight into an intense first verse. He starts by once again repressing his emotions and inner turmoil by stating how he's riding in an expensive car, being the Rolls-Royce Cullinan, and pulling in around 400 grand. The intensity of the track only reinforces this, making it very clear that Tyler's trying his best to avoid his feelings and turning to being loud and braggadocious to try help him cope. He once again mentions Switzerland, and specifically Geneva, which is a location he's brought up several times already on the album, also saying once again that his earlobes look like headlights because of the bright yellow colour that his earrings give off, and ends the verse off by introducing Lil Uzi Vert onto the track. This leads us right into the second verse, of course being delivered by Lil Uzi Vert. He starts the verse in the exact same braggadocious fashion as Tyler's verse, mentioning several expensive fashion brands that he's wearing, such as Chanel, Gucci, and Louis Vuitton, with the first two being delivered simply as their first letter. Uzi then alludes to being in a similar situation that Tyler was in with the girl, talking about a girl he's having sex with, but is also trying to either hold on to a relationship or want something more serious with another man. Uzi uses wordplay in relation to food, comparing his dick to meat and saying that she's trying to save all the plates, but keeps eating. Uzi then focuses on the expensive things he owns, mentioning having an E and B on the back of his seat, referencing Ettore Bugatti, who is the founder of the luxury Bugatti brand of car, with Uzi actually owning a Bugatti Veyron, which he purchased from famous boxer Floyd Mayweather. Uzi then talks about how the amount of money he has can change his view on certain people, saying to this girl that he's been having sex with that the more money he gets, the less he wants to have sex with her, and the less he can be bothered to even text or communicate with her. Uzi ends his verse off simply giving a few more lines about his expensive possessions before then leading into the chorus. But before we get into that, a little detail I wanted to just bring up that I think not only enhances the track but fits so well tonally with the album is the distant and panned sound of the telephone while Lil Uzi delivered his verse. I feel like it really amps you up towards the end of the album, setting in the point that Tyler's world is basically about to fall apart again, with this song basically being his last triumphant stand before that happens. The chorus brings Tyler back on the track, delivering vocals in a strange, broken style, with the lyrics on this chorus of course featuring Tyler flexing his wealth, but also some lines about riding to a dinner, taping, and being out of time. I'm not fully sure what these lyrics mean, but they definitely remind me of his song Off E Igor, "A boy is a gun," and specifically the lyrics where he talks about his partner at the time inviting their ex to eat breakfast with him. I feel like these lyrics have a similar sentiment, this time with Tyler being the one to rock up on the girl and her boyfriend, with the delivery on these lyrics only adding to this, sounding completely out of his mind. We then get led to a third verse rapped by Pharrell Williams, who opens up his verse in a similar fashion to Uzi's by first listing the clothes that he's wearing, and using the first letter to signify their brand. As Pharrell continues, however, it becomes clear that his verse is much more based in his own ego, saying that anyone trying to compete with him will take a double V, of course relating to the idea that if you put two V's together, you get a W, signifying a win. He further elaborates on his ego by comparing himself to a hornet trapped in a bumblebee hive, linking to how Pharrell thinks he's on another level entirely to everyone else, with hornets being a much more dangerous threat than a bumblebee. Despite this, of course, he's trapped in the hive, which represents the generalization of a lot of music in general, with Pharrell not believing that he's getting the proper credit that he deserves, especially when comparing his music to everyone else's. He also describes this in another way, by saying that people only look at the sun's surface, showing how a lot of people will only look at the most popular artists in a genre, and then assume that everyone else who makes similar music in that genre will sound exactly the same. We can see that Pharrell also suffers from some of the same problems as Tyler, as he mentions a similar situation that we saw Tyler mention on Lemonhead, where Pharrell bought an extremely expensive car for simply one occasion and hasn't used it since, much like Tyler's cars, which are just sitting around and collecting dust. Towards the end of this verse, Pharrell focuses more on this difference he feels between him and other rappers, showing the distinction in levels by saying that whereas a lot of artists have bodyguards, he has an entire secret service to back him up. He also mentions how he doesn't like the fake personas that rappers often put up, saying that if the shit's fake, he doesn't respect it because it's simply clickbait and untrue to how the artist actually lives their life. He ends the verse off almost coming to the realization of how pointless all of this materialism is, learning from his past experiences of wasting money on stuff he never uses, and asking questions like what the actual difference is if you're wearing an expensive watch or not. It categorically doesn't make you a better person, and is only really worn for vanity, but he still understands where people come from in relation to this, ending the verse off by saying that the hungry and envious eyes that a lot of people have can get fixated on this stuff, thinking that if you have these things, it will in turn make you happy, with Tyler over the course of this album proving that this isn't true. This takes us back to the chorus, repeating the exact same lyrics as before, until we swiftly get brought to the penultimate track. WILSHIRE is the second longest track on the album, being over 8 minutes in length, with this song also being solely focused on Tyler's verses. An interesting detail to note about this track is that it was in fact recorded by Tyler in one long take, with his second attempt making the final cut for the album. He claims that it was recorded on a shitty handheld microphone, which adds immensely to the distorted atmosphere of the track. I think it's also important to mention that a large part of this song is quite self-explanatory, with Tyler's storytelling being the most compelling, engaging, and on point as ever. What we're about to witness is a recap of the entire story that we've just experienced play out in one long track, with Tyler finally choosing to listen to his feelings and project them on a song, instead of trying to hide them under layers of ego. From the first few lyrics, we immediately know that Tyler is once again back on the topic of the girl, starting from the top and explaining the scenario of the first day that they met. Tyler describes that he knew that he felt something towards the girl immediately when she first spoke to him, and describes her subtly reciprocating by eye-fucking him across the table, referencing the well-known idea that people tend to end up staring at something or someone that they heavily desire. He reveals that the girl asked if they were from the same city, and brings up the idea to hang out with each other, which Tyler of course agreed to, claiming he'd be stupid not to, before listing off all the traits of the girl that he finds especially attractive, like her long legs, sense of humour, and great taste in general. Tyler describes the sensation of being around this girl as almost magical, describing how they clicked almost immediately, with any thoughts related to anything sexual being at the back of his mind, simply because her presence was enough to satisfy him. Tyler reveals what happened when him and this girl hung out, saying that they talked all night until morning came, time, with Tyler eventually revealing his true feelings about how he feels towards her, with the girl reciprocating these feelings and saying that she feels the same way about Tyler, with the only issue being that there's another man in the picture, with the girl already having a boyfriend. Tyler is taken aback by this, saying it was unexpected, but ultimately won't stop him from hanging out with her, deciding that perhaps being friends will be sufficient enough. Tyler then peels back another layer to the story, also claiming that her boyfriend isn't just some random guy Tyler's never heard of, but is in fact a friend of his. Tyler shows his lack of loyalty towards whoever this friend is by saying that under the surface he really hopes that she breaks up with him, because although he's got morals and won't cross the line and actually betray his friend by sleeping with his girl, the connection he feels to her is so strong that he wishes they would just break up. Tyler says that the feeling he got from this girl is unparalleled and something he's never experienced before, also revealing that him and this girl spent about 2 weeks together, mentioning specifically how they only missed out on 1 day with each other between this time. He also brings up the well-known saying of bros before hoes, an idea that your friend should always be a more essential priority than trying to get with a sexual partner. However, Tyler disagrees with this, humorously saying that he'd much prefer to hold hands with this girl as opposed to some lame handshake that would be in its place. He ends this first verse basically capping off the first stage in their relationship, with Tyler saying that he's not denying that they can still be friends because of the strong connection they share, but he'd much prefer something more, with him deciding to play it cool and perhaps wait for a chance to open up so he can get with the girl. There's a short interlude which separates the first and second verses, with the lines referring to the same sentiment as the first verse, about being too late and finding the girl at the wrong time, with her still being in a relationship. This takes us to the second verse, with Tyler then going into what happened after she initially rejected him, an aspect that hasn't been as shown off previously in the album. It seems that once he realised that a relationship was on the table, Tyler became very aware of his wrongdoings, asking her over a FaceTime call to delete any text messages that she had with him, with the girl replying that she was obviously going to, because she doesn't want her boyfriend finding out any of the stuff she was saying in relation to feeling the same way Tyler feels. He then acknowledges how much he crossed the line, even momentarily trying to deny any involvement in the situation, however then tries to justify his actions by saying that he hasn't even seen his friend in months, and whenever he tries to get in contact, he never hits back, further trying to distance himself from his friend so he feels better about trying to get with his girl. We then see how undying his love really is towards this girl, trying his best to not take no for an answer and asking her to try convince her boyfriend to let her hang out with Tyler, but also have him there, so that everything they're doing is taking place right in front of his lenses. Despite Tyler saying nothing's malicious, he's only saying that in terms of how he wants the boyfriend to feel, with him coming up with the plan of easing the boyfriend's guard by showing that he appears to just be a good friend of his girl's and nothing more. It seems like this plan actually ended up going forward, with Tyler then recounting that they went to see a movie and after went outside and smoked weed, once again showing Tyler's uncharacteristic nature when around this girl. Tyler then becomes very aware of the boyfriend's suspicions, saying that the guy's not stupid and can easily notice that whenever Tyler and the girl talk, they always move away from him, and that whenever they laugh together, it just makes him even more frustrated. Tyler seems to not really care though, even saying that if he fucks their friendship up, presumably in terms of both the girl and his friend, he doesn't really care, because trying to get with her is worth it. However, he then semi-retracts the statement, claiming that he can't really bring himself to do that though, because not only does the boyfriend not deserve it, but Tyler's only known this girl for a short amount of time, with the boyfriend having a much closer and deeper knowledge of the girl, meaning that even if Tyler ended up getting the girl, it might not last long. This wouldn't be a problem for Tyler, as we previously saw him mention that commitment wasn't a priority for him, but he doesn't want to risk fucking up the boyfriend's relationship completely just for his own selfish needs. This takes us to another short interlude, where Tyler further elaborates on the surface line at the end of the verse before taking us into a third verse. We can presume another jump in time happens between this verse and the previous one, with Tyler opening up by saying that he hasn't seen the girl in a couple weeks and starts to think that her boyfriend caught on to the connection they shared and decided to keep her away from him. Even though nothing happened, the intention was still fully there, so Tyler starts to feel immensely guilty towards any arguments he may have caused in their relationship, saying that he tried to have self-control, but clearly didn't have enough to stop himself from trying to get with the girl. He brings up how sad he's been that he can't see her, saying it's even worse knowing that she's in the same city, because she's so close but he can't see her face. He claims how he can't eat because it makes him nauseous that she's with her boyfriend, with Tyler's jealousy becoming more and more prominent, ending the verse off saying that despite apparently having the world in his hands because of all the money he has, he still hasn't got her. He reinforces this in another short interlude, with him simply stating once again that he's got so many expensive cars and houses, but his mind still isn't allowing him to feel happiness because he so desperately wants a relationship with the girl. This takes us to the fourth and longest verse, starting with another jump forward in time, this being a period where her boyfriend had left for a couple days, leaving his girl alone, giving Tyler the opportunity to hang out with her again. Tyler claims that upon hearing this, he cleared his schedule, as well as his head, as to not appear weird or obsessive when meeting the girl again. The girl ends up coming round Tyler's house, as they start discussing what they can do in the time they have together, with Tyler trying to come up with places that they can go on holiday, like Tulum or Capri, but ultimately doesn't mind wherever they go or whatever they do, saying that he could die with her and be at peace with how everything turned out. Over this period of time that they spend together, it's revealed that the girl was supposed to go back to her house to spend time with her best friend, with Tyler saying that he won't be able to come with her, obviously because of the risk of her boyfriend discovering they're hanging out. Tyler also only cleared his schedule for this week, saying that he's too busy next week to hang out, leading to the girl cancelling her plans with her friend and deciding to stay with Tyler for another week. After this week, however, her boyfriend starts to become suspicious, with him being unaware of where his girl is, leading to Tyler listing off all of the things they've been getting up to, such as playing tennis, going to fancy restaurants, going shopping, and getting manicures. All of these things are costing a fair amount, comparing it to an investment, with the profit to him being the happiness that the girl feels. Tyler then acknowledges how awkward the situation really is, talking about how the girl has to act like she's not into him when around her boyfriend, but also starts standing up for himself, and trying to pin down exactly how she feels towards him, saying that she has to start being more honest and actually explain what she's gonna do and who she's gonna choose, with her still showing a lot of affection for her boyfriend, despite that affection being non-existent when hanging around with Tyler. This then leads to Tyler almost trying to convince this girl to pick him over her boyfriend, basically bargaining with her, saying that anything she wants, he can get for her. Tyler lets the girl know how special she is to him, by saying that no matter what country he's in, he's had the chance to get into a relationship and have sex with as many women as he possibly wanted, saying that anyone who knows him can back this up. But the fact is, he didn't, showing how important and significant this girl is to him. He also recounts having to go on a date with an actress, and having the girl wait in the car for him until he was done eating, once again showing his general uninterest in any other potential partner. He claims that once he was done, he came back to the car and spent some time talking with the girl about who they are, with her admitting that being around Tyler is almost like an addiction, comparing it to being like heroin. This isn't only because the immense amount of love she feels for him, but also aspects like her confidence being boosted by the things Tyler says to her. The girl shows her maturity by not being selfish and saying that even though it makes her feel good, she still doesn't want to hurt her boyfriend, saying that the situation is too awkward and she just wants to be done with it. She recognizes that she wants Tyler, but also knows that it brings more trouble into her life than necessary, stating that whenever she hangs out with him, it starts problems in her relationship, but also that whenever she's not with Tyler, she's always pondering about what he's up to, and if she should leave her boyfriend and go with him instead. It's then revealed that the girl actually ended up telling her boyfriend what was going on between her and Tyler, with the boyfriend getting pissed off, with Tyler being completely understanding of why. He states that they never crossed the line, perhaps alluding to how no mention of any sexual activities have taken place between Tyler and the girl, but it doesn't change the fact that the intention was still there. Tyler describes how after hearing this, the boyfriend picked the girl up and got into an argument, before then talking about everyone's different energies, stating that his energy was telling both the boyfriend and the girl to get lost. The girl's energy simply wanted peace and no fighting, and finally saying that he couldn't decipher the boyfriend's energy because he never speaks to him. Tyler recounts how the boyfriend started to call the girl things like his bitch after witnessing him do things like make her laugh, with his insecurities being very very apparent to Tyler. He then states once again that he 100% is still in the wrong though, before leaving a short gap in his lyrics, signifying another jump forward in time. After all of these events transpired, Tyler reveals that he was still in contact with the girl, picking her up, presumably to hang out again like they used to, but immediately being able to tell that something was off. He notices her dry lips and strange energy, most likely reflecting in an anxious and uptight behaviour. This all culminates in the pair of them getting confused at their attitudes, leading to both of them crying in the car for about an hour. Tyler describes his shirt looking like a shower head because of the amount he's been crying, before then definitively stating that him and the girl had to cool off whatever chance they had to get into a relationship. Because of how deeply this affected Tyler, despite how detailed he's already been up to this point, he decides to skip some of the details and just say that it was one of the worst nights of his life, comparing it to hell. Tyler also states that he took 3 L's that night, meaning losses, those being that he's been rejected, he's lost money paying for a hotel room for them to stay in, and he still has to sleep in the same room as her, even after all of this has taken place, making everything even more awkward. Tyler claims that he didn't get much sleep, and upon waking up the next morning fell to his knees because of the lack of energy and overwhelming anxiety that has consumed him at this point. He describes spending the day driving around the city with no real motive, constantly having tears in his eyes. His longtime bodyguard, Vil, is also in the car with him, saying that he needed him there so Tyler didn't do anything dumb like try to kill himself because he's extremely emotional. Tyler says that the girl ticked every box for him, feeling like he was led on, then swiftly pushed off a cliff. He then goes into a back and forth about whose fault it is, first saying that it's his fault because he shouldn't have been screwing around with a friend's girlfriend in the first place, before then saying that it's actually her fault because she also felt that connection which Tyler felt and actively reciprocated it. He reflects on the kinds of things they talked about to try give himself clarity on the situation, mentioning how they discussed things like their kinks and were always really cautious about when they met up, with Tyler rightfully stating that you shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff if you're in a serious relationship with someone else. With his frustration really coming out towards this ending part, he claims that the girl shouldn't act like a saint because she's just as in the wrong as he is, mentioning that despite him offering her to do things like hang out in his home, she still had the choice to say no, but didn't. Tyler then says that he's the only one to really take an L though, which may sound like self-pity, but is ultimately true. Tyler had his hopes up and got them crushed, with the girl being able to have her fun with him before returning to her boyfriend. Despite this, Tyler says that he can't bring himself to say anything truly bad or negative about her, calling her up and saying that they can't end their friendship on bad terms, leading to both of them agreeing and Tyler saying that they'll always be good friends. This reeks of being bittersweet, however, with him saying that he's sure they'll end up laughing about their little fling in the future, with Tyler never being happy with how everything turned out. As we reach the end of the verse, Tyler simply says that all of this is simply his perspective, and that despite there being multiple perspectives, he kept his as real as possible all throughout, even stating right at the end that he'll always love this girl, and that if her boyfriend were to ever do something like physically assault her, Tyler would feel no remorse in getting him killed. This leads us to the outro, where Tyler simply talks for the rest of the track, mentioning everything that this track included, with him saying that he's a bad person, how much he was hurt by the situation, and how much he still loves the girl. He explains how he thought he was bulletproof because of his self-belief and self-confidence, but found out just how easily he could be crushed under the weight of not getting something that he really wanted. He ends the track off saying that it was just bad timing, and that whether he likes it or not, this is simply another chapter of his life that he's gonna have to simply move on from.
Destination?
Coming into this final track, we once again hear an instrumental that is very similar to Tyler's album Wolf, with the heavy emphasis on digital brass and string instruments. We start the track off with Drama saying that after all of the events that have taken place on the album, they're heading to a remote destination away from everyone else, perhaps alluding to how Tyler essentially disappears in between each album's release. Drama says that they've been everywhere, with the only place that they haven't yet travelled being time, obviously linking to to Tyler's unsure mindset going into the future, with his past also being filled with regret and sadness. Tyler starts the verse off mentioning how outsiders thinks his records smell like bleach, perhaps referencing the outlandish and controversial topics that he chooses to touch on, that he's also been criticized on throughout his career. He also mentions that he's able to travel where he wants, with his amount of acclaim and wealth at this point in his career, making it so that he's able to go wherever he wants, whenever. This would most likely relate to how he feels his home is almost a tainted environment at this point, because of how many times the girl would come over and hang out with him. Tyler then describes the process of traveling far away, not only trying to get away from his usual environment, but also symbolically running from his past, saying that he sips some mint tea and takes his shoes off until he eventually falls asleep and wakes up as a foreigner in a country that he's not familiar with. We see Tyler once again distracting himself from his true issues, deciding as opposed to facing them, he'll simply do things like go to the beach and get a tan, and continue to travel around the world and experience new things until the old thoughts which currently plague his mind are slowly forgotten. Tyler describes his growth in wealth once again through forms of transportation, being confused that rich people don't travel as much as he does, claiming that he went from traveling on foot to traveling in expensive cars to private jets, taking him literally wherever he wants in the world. He encourages people to seek new horizons, emphasizing travel as a good way to experience new things that you'll remember for a lifetime, giving examples like taking a tour in Japan or going scuba diving in Cuba. This takes us to a break, where drama gets reintroduced, hyping up Tyler and saying that they're ahead of everyone, with us also being able to hear Tyler singing the phrase, "Baby, we on a safari." Safaris are most well known to be a journey, usually taken in a car, through certain parts of the environment, with the primary goal being to let people observe wild animals. Some of the most popular safaris are in places like Africa, which have a huge variety of uncommon wildlife. Tyler's using this phrase by applying it to how he's traveling the world and observing different things that he would have never seen before. This takes us into the second verse, where Tyler takes a rather self-deprecating tone, saying that all of his cars look retarded and what he considers the stupid decisions behind some of his actions, like choosing particular cars to drive to reflect what mood he's currently in. He stays on with this theme of his ever-changing moods, claiming that he's been constantly transforming ever since Tracee Ellis Ross was UPN, referencing the early 2000s show Girlfriends, who featured Tracee Ellis Ross. The show was owned by United Paramount Network, which eventually merged into CW in 2006, making Tyler 15 at the time, clearly showing his constantly changing views and opinions when growing up. I should also mention that Tracee Ellis Ross appears in the Earthquake music video, and is also daughter to singer Diana Ross, who almost definitely has a huge influence on Tyler's music. Tyler then references his Grammy win once again, noting how because of Eagle's quality, it was impossible for him to lose again, with his previous album Flower Boy only being nominated and being beaten by Kendrick Lamar's Damn. He stays on these same vain ideas for a few more lines until seemingly reflecting on his entire life in this last half of the verse. He starts by looking to his family, saying that his mother named him Tyler, but his friends call him T, before then using the word cool in reference to his bank, who phone him up whenever his line is free. Tyler then mentions how he named his skateboard Bunny Hop, a phrase we've heard scattered all throughout this album, before saying it's Baudelaire Wolfie though, showing the mixture between Tyler's more knowledgeable and mature mindset he now has, and his more outrageous and offensive past that he's incorporated throughout the album as well. Tyler also mentions how women call him Our because of how long he eats them out for, the most obvious example of Tyler shattering anyone's expectations on what his sexuality was before this album. Tyler then describes the pink loafers he's wearing that scuff quickly, as well as a Fiat which costs $1.60, referencing the Call Me If You Get Lost branded car which we saw in the Side Street teaser, which was a Fiat 131 Abarth. Tyler ends the verse off saying that he keeps everything $1.50, meaning to keep everything as real as possible, and saying that he's only 29 years old, but has had a focused mindset ever since his career began. In the outro, Tyler makes the most prominent reference to his past work in the entire album, loudly shouting "Wolf" at the end of the track, in a very similar tone to how he delivered lyrics on his past albums. This pretty much lets everyone know that all of the references and potential links to his previous pieces of work work that are scattered through the album are completely intentional and are all put in place to show Tyler's reflective mindset. This ends off the track, as well as the album, with the overall package debatably being Tyler's most truthful and introspective project he's ever made. The links we made to the Wolf trilogy before the album's release can now be seen simply as an acknowledgement of the past, with Tyler looking back on how he used to act during a period of immense heartbreak in relation to the girl on the album. Once again, the title of the album not only relates to the heavy emphasis on travelling to foreign countries that Tyler's not familiar with, but also to the actual content of the album, with there seemingly being so many disconnected themes and patterns throughout the album that you can easily get lost in, only discovering the meaning and making connections under further analysis like we've just seen. Call Me If You Get Lost essentially boils down to a journey through life, and the twists and turns that come along with it, oftentimes finding ourselves lost and confused due to events that transpire around us. The ending reflects the reality of the situation, not ending dramatically and sad like Igor, but instead just sort of abruptly closing, with us being aware that Tyler had his heart broken and now he's moving on. It somewhat reminds me of the show BoJack Horseman, which I just finished watching, whose ending is very similar, where we expect the main character to fall apart and die at the end, but having our expectations subverted, and ending by just stating that life goes on. This was arguably the most detailed analysis I've ever created, with me also working intensely hard to get this out as quick as possible. So any support you can show me in the channel, whether that be a like on the video, a subscribe, or a comment on what you thought, would be immensely appreciated. I know a lot of you guys were waiting for this, and I hope this analysis gave you the answers you were looking for. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.